Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I've never been a reader, so I don't know how it's possible, but there's a proverb I know. The dead cannot reveal any secrets. Given my current state, I choose to disagree. My name is Narnia Kazarian, but I was the chronic Cool of Narnia entity. It's cute, right? Yes, an obvious play on words, homage to the C.S. Lewis novels that were my namesake. Maybe it was a tad narcissistic, but the pun worked within the confines of my popular online beauty channel. Glamily members, it's your girl Narnia K dropping in one last time before Friday night's Trendies, streaming live from the Dolby Theater in downtown LA at 8. As I plug the fledgling influencer award show, around 700,000 viewers would hear those words, the last spoken in life. That multitude of people does not log off in perfect harmony. My assumption was a glitch when the digits on the view tracker dropped into nothingness almost as quickly as they disappeared. It made little sense at the time. Now, it all makes sense. So many things make sense now. My current reality is that I've been reliving my final days and now see the missed details that should have smacked me in the face then. It began when I closed the laptop on that last broadcast and missed Daddy's evident note next to the PC. The Escalade has half a tank. You must fill it up before leaving. The replay is starting again. After finishing that last live stream, my iPhone quakes, but I hit silent without looking at the screen. I assume it's the usual influx of after-show fan comments, and I can't be bothered. It's always an admirer praising me or a troll seeking attention. It's time to leave Calabasas anyway, as I have planned to spend the next 2 days prepping for the awards ceremony an hour away in the solitude of the family cabin, hidden deep in the woods away from LA traffic or trick-or-treaters. As camping trips go, it wouldn't exactly be that. Looking back, it was hardly a rough outing for me, the 22-year-old, privileged, entitled daughter of real estate magnate Ephraim Kazarian and famed 70s model Janet Price. Rich people are bizarre. We exist in one world, ours, while everyone else does their own thing. A mere cabin to Daddy is another $3 million chunk of dreams. Yes, I now realize the life of Narnia Kazarian was quite charmed. Realizing it now is too late and pointless. I think wealth and fame led to my demise. Actually, I'm sure of it. Vanity and excess bred tunnel vision. Have I mentioned that you hear a ghost? My channel's success surprised no one. Ariel was my best friend and the starlet of the Hulu horror series 13 Terrors, and she tweeted about my channel early on. Lennon was a friend whose mom was reality TV famous and also tweeted photos of a makeover I gave her, double-dipping into our shared quest for attention. That was huge. Then, God herself smiled upon me, because when a Kardashian follows you, you become insta-famous. My beauty game was decent, maybe above average, but I'm honest, since I'm dead now, it was nothing compared to rival streamers. However, they had no names to drop or celebs to tag. Pretty and rich consistently exceeds skill. That's the reality in that space. At the time, though, I assumed the success was my birthright. I'm not sure how long since time is not real anymore, but I've been watching the final days of my life like a documentary. I'm embarrassed. I'm watching now. I watched the Escalade amble through my gated neighborhood on that gorgeous October day with half a tank of gas as my selfie fingers clutch the phone and my perched lips curve into action. I swerve and almost sideswipe a car, only to laugh about it. Once I post whatever was so urgent, the likes and upvotes, things the material girl I was always craved, merely trickle in with a whimper, unlike the typical barrage of heart emoticons. I'm curious for sure, but I have no time to wonder as suddenly the app freezes and the phone rattles with violence. Another Amber Alert, I figure, and toss the tech addiction aside. Missed calls from Mom and unread texts from Daddy are also tossed aside, but I don't realize it. The living me wouldn't have. The dead me notices everything, and I wonder if this is hell. Merging onto the PCH, I peruse my speech while soaking in the coastline. Breaking news interrupts the radio, an annoyance quickly discarded in favor of Lana Del Rey on Spotify. I think the ocean view must be spectacular since cars are stopping and people exit their vehicles to stare. Tourists. I laugh aloud at the out-of-state plates. Go away, you can't afford to live here. Why torture yourselves? Ugh, that privileged voice. At the cabin, our caretaker is missing. A mental note to have been fired is filed. How will the massage therapist get in tomorrow? Or the driver on Friday? I open the gate and leave it that way, seeing my inconvenience, but somehow not seeing the note been affixed to the wrought iron bars. Then I carry my bags like a savage. What a fool I was looking back, lugging that oversized junk in my red-soled Louboutin heels. Night 1 is immediately exhausting. The Wi-Fi won't work, so my toys are useless. Logic says to read the text from my parents, but I opt to play Candy Crush as the battery drains. I plan to stream my prep work. People love the behind-the-scenes voyeur shot. My primary dress is a vintage, original 1978 Versace that Mom wore in a Vanity Fair spread with Cher and Farrah Fawcett. In case of disaster, I have my backup gown and my backup's backup, both Tom Ford creations. I have $3,000 in cosmetics, Chanel, Dior, and MAC for one use. My hair is pre-coiffed and only a few minor adjustments will be required, which my chronic cool can easily handle. I have everything, but the most important thing, I have no audience to watch the process thanks to the Wi-Fi horrifying me. I know this dead version of me will be 22 for the rest of eternity, but I feel like a wise old sage when absorbing the pretentiousness of the living me. I decided to be gross and watch cable since that's the disaster I'm left with, but all channels are blank, except one. A local station struggles through, and some anchor with helmet hair is being dramatic. Probably another wildfire, I guess. Click. I'm bored already. Minutes later, gently placed cucumber slices blanket my eyes, and I slide my sensory deprivation pods into my ears and fall into a slumber to fight the frustration. Or at least I think I did. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I stir. Initially, I knew I must have dreamt it because the cracking, thundering explosion couldn't have penetrated my noise-canceling pods. Regardless, I'm now awake. Gone is the electricity, the lifeblood for everything I am. My weary eyes peer outside through a now fractured window, cucumber juice hitting my pupils, and I see nothing. Had I looked closer, I might have noticed the dearth of stars in an area famous for skywatching. Instead, I danced to the tune of Self-Pity. There is no way to Skype with Dr. Paulson, so I give up on the evening again. Oh, an emergency generator sits alone in the basement, but I'm not about to touch that greasy thing. I could scoot into town had my gas tank not been stuck on E. I nestle, sleepy and annoyed, under my Burberry covers and weighted blanket. Thursday is even worse. No power, only one day until the awards. All ways to tell time are drained. Flashing a cursory glance toward the window, I notice a faded yellow haze is outside, which is not normal. Eerie lighting does not pique my interest. Most people would have been ravaged with curiosity, but not the fabulous Narnia Kazarian. Why? Breakfast is paramount on my mind. After all, it is my final meal until after the awards tomorrow. Salivating at the thought of avocado toast, I realize there's no way to actually toast it. I take malicious glee now in watching the living me falter because it's so ridiculous and unfathomable how dense I was. Seeing my face morph into a pathetic pout is strangely satisfying in this dead place I live now. This dastardly abode called hindsight. Breakfast becomes sips of grapefruit juice as I attempt to get anything from my gadgets. The devices remain silent, but not everything is muted. Sirens blare in the hills, and with clarity. What do? I soak. I soak in more Lana with the remaining life on my MP3, and I soak in the basement jacuzzi, enjoying the still warm water while it lasts. The living me didn't see the battery-powered radio displayed atop the generator. The dead me can only see it, and nothing else. This part makes me sick. After enjoying the cabin's amenities, I gaze into my vanity mirror with great affection for myself for several hours. An antique porcelain brush weaves through strawberry blonde strands as I practice emoting. from my good side. The question of when the girl from the spa will arrive for my foot massage pokes me. My pampering is scheduled for 6, so I'll use the girl's phone to call Daddy and fix everything wrong with the stupid cabin, like the inept caretaker and shoddy wiring, and the rest of the unacceptable misfortunes that don't belong in a civilized world. The spa girl is late. Waiting is not something I do. I wait, and I wait some more. A solar tiki torch allows me to inspect the Versace with a feverish vigor for flaws. I investigate the cabin and saunter into Daddy's media room, which is covered with walls of DVDs. His antique viewing platform makes me laugh. His collection of movies is not my vibe. Independence Day, Idiocracy, Clueless? No Channing Tatum anywhere. Darkness envelops the cabin and Spa Girl is AWOL, so muscle memory causes me to reach for my phone to drag the spa over social. There's still no electricity, and I've watched this part often since I've been dead, and this stupidity always makes me label the living me as such a pretentious, affected twit. All hope in the reflexology session dies, and so does the tiki torch. The cabin has become the darkest variant of Onyx possible. Through my periscope into the final hours of my life, I watch myself stumble through the shadows, reaching for walls and cursing. I see myself willingly dismissing the popping outside as holiday fireworks, even though a simpleton knows that Halloween is not a fireworks event. Look, damn it, look! Pay attention! See the signs the universe is throwing at your stupid, pretty face! Now I shout at my living self during these reruns, knowing the ending never changes. This silly response beckons the definition of insanity. More deflating frustration always follows this scene. A duo of helicopters will race and hover overhead as the living me stumbles into bed in a huff. Wildfires, I guess again. No logic attempted. Any inquisitive nature at all would have deduced that no flame had ever reached the swanky getaway swallowed deep into the woods of the wealthy. Here's the part where I watch the living me throw a tantrum. I scream into my plush pillows, I need my things for tomorrow. Why wasn't everything fixed yet? Why was I being treated like a poor person? Kendall's handlers would have checked in by now. Nikki DeYager, Addison Rae, they weren't worried whether they could power a hairdryer or stream a pre-show tomorrow. They have nothing riding on it as I do. I'm negotiating a sponsorship with Sephora. Thoughts of finally having my own money instead of Daddy's paltry allowance had swam around for weeks. No more suffering through Escalades without personalized stitching or being forced to live in that tiny 5-bedroom guest house on his property. It was unfair, these burdens. Not a single person living is more cursed than I am. Amazingly, I had these tone-deaf, privileged thoughts. Every time I watch this ordeal unfold, I am thrilled that I die the next day. Somewhere in the middle of the night, heavy thuds erupt from the front door, and it jolts me upright, and I peek through the curtain below. Had trick-or-treaters or pranksters trespassed? The banging continues, and I can make out a rough outline of some car a cop would drive. I think maybe I see the shape of lights atop the vehicle, but I'm not sure. Then, the living me came to the most foolish conclusion a person could conceive in such a moment. It had to be the spa girl. Was she insane? What good would a foot massage be at this hour? This girl must have tried in vain to make up for her lateness upon hearing who her client was. She was probably trying to save her job, but I am irate. I go back under my layers and put a pillow over my head. Eventually, the thumping fades into the acoustics of a car driving away. I manage to doze off in an orgy of anger, frustration, and sadness, visions of vengeance, my only calming force. Death becomes me the next day. Morning has finally arrived, but the electricity has not. I run through the usual predictable failures, attempting magic with the gadgets that will never manifest. The sun is dim today. I mumble as I pass the window without bothering to see why. No longer will the dead me mention how ignorant I was in life because it's becoming entirely redundant and it crushes me to watch. Tears flow as I realize the power is gone for good. I spent hours fiddling with my hair before finally settling on an updo that was junior prom quality. Maybe battery-powered blow dryers weren't so gauche. Now comes the foreign ringing. Landline telephones were never something I'd used, but I'd watched old TV shows. How hard could it be? I would never know. I continued to be ashamed of my imperviousness in life. How could I think it was a security system glitch? Just how? My naivete was criminal and, obviously, fatal. Time blurs, and I can only assume the ceremony is getting close. The limo could arrive at any time. I apply my makeup quite well with minimal lighting, at least enough to draw attention to my face and away from my hair. I slink into the Versace with ease, the hunger pangs in my stomach telling me why. Things that sparkle are adorned with perfection, and lastly, I wiggle my feet into a pair of peep-toe pumps that the Jessica Simpson line is paying me to be seen in. Time to exhale and try to reclaim my center, as my meditation guru in Bel Air has taught me. Then, my silhouette throws its shadow through the doorframe for the first time in days. Well, this is when it all made sense to the living me, when all of the missed signs and blatant warnings flash before me. Quite a jarring thing to realize mere seconds after it's too late. I suddenly remembered the note from Daddy. The SUV was empty now, and there was no driving out of here. The people on the highway staring above at something. The frantic attempts by others to reach me. The sirens and breaking news and police officers and missed miracles. Even Daddy's silly movie collection now appears to have been a gutting case of foreshadowing. None of this matters now, though. If irony has a taste, it is very, very bitter. Dressed like a queen, I must appear to be presenting myself to them as the elite my celestial neighborhood has to offer. Or perhaps they understand our ways and think I'm giving Halloween my best shot. Anyway, it is quite an image to absorb. Almost too beautiful to be horrifying. Almost. Like a checkerboard crafted with precision and exact mathematical spacing, the sky above is filled with the ovular ships for miles and beyond. The massive array of the invading army is a lesson in eerie excellence as the behemoth vessels rest in silence and stillness. No longer does life prove its existence through the twittering of birds or the banal echoes of humans at play. The alien menace floats as conquering gods, and I know in this exact moment that all is lost. At least it was quick and painless. The piercing yet calming light from the ship directly above as it entered my soul. That was the last thing I'll ever remember of life. Now, I'm cursed to replay the heedless flaws of my character until a higher power dictates otherwise. I suppose I can take solace in looking good while I wait. One thing is certain, I'm proof that the paranormal is real. I mean, who else can say they've answered the questions of whether we're alone in the universe, as well as if there's something beyond death, all in one day? Neither is more frightening than the pedestrian detachment that brought me here. The only proverb I ever knew said, "The dead cannot reveal any secrets." It said nothing of revealing the dreadful, cruel ruination that comes from being oblivious.
How long had the dark figure been standing there? Standing there, overtly lurking. I could see the ossified figure in plain sight, motionless, just staring up to the second-floor window where I was peering from. Who could it be? Why were they here? My skin crawled with nerves on edge. My yard was lit by moonlight, and the orb illuminated the figure with a haunting backlight. The hooded figure was alone. I was alone. A terrifying thought occurred to me. No, it was an unsettling question that came to mind. Had I locked the doors and secured the windows before taking my shower? I was convinced I definitely had, but better be safe than sorry. I talked myself into going downstairs to double check. I was dreading to descend to the bottom floor. I'd have to take my eyes off the figure in the yard, only long enough to do my security checks. Once on the ground floor, I found everything was secure downstairs, which satisfied me immensely. I had recently seen on the evening news about an incident happening at the park where a pervert was spying on people. A 40-year-old man had been caught near the woman's toilets, behaving unseemly. This man was originally reported to have been doing lewd acts and acting inappropriately behind some bushes before being arrested. I'm always reading about some disgusting person being disgraceful and obscene in our city. I simply don't have the time to consider such things. And now someone of questionable character was lurking on my own lawn. I don't like phoning the police because they can make a ridiculous fiasco out of it. Maybe the guy out there had an impeccant name, a fleckless reputation, and a noble character. How would I know that with him just dumbly standing there in the cold night air? Although the temptation to look out of the downstairs windows into the yard presented itself to me, I dared not look from the downstairs windows for fear the dark figure might be at the window. Something told me that would be too close. If I saw such a thing, I would undeniably die on the spot of a heart attack. I made my way back upstairs and peeked from the same window. The figure appeared to have moved closer to the house. I had great concerns this might happen. I never saw it move, but I swore it was closer than before. What could it want? No rational person would dress this way, cloaked in black with a hood. It was nowhere near Halloween, so why the costume? Why the sinister getup? I looked at the time. It was 11:50 p.m. The hour is late. Most everyone should have already been asleep, or at least in bed and settled for the night. Maybe this person outside had no home. Possibly they were homeless. I can't take in anyone. I barely take care of myself these days. I'd been exhausted when I came to the bedroom to shower, but now I was wide awake, fatigued, suspicious, and afraid. I persisted in watching the figure nervously and comfortably, not knowing if it saw me looking down at it. Of course, decidedly, it could see me. It was looking right at me, I assumed, but strangely, I never saw its eyes. What sort of person dresses in such a manner and then stands on someone's lawn and stares? This had to be a children's prank of some sort. I questioned myself. Who did I know that was capable of such a practical joke? Lewis always thought of himself as a funny guy. He was more annoying than humorous, but I doubt if he would pull a stunt such as this. Lewis had a family now, responsibilities, and a solid job. I seriously doubted if this old-school buddy of mine would risk an altercation or worse, a police arrest to pull something off like this. I had no enemies, no one who might have a vendetta or a score to settle. I lived mostly peaceably among everyone in the community. I could not think of a single soul who might want to intimidate or frighten me. It was nearing midnight, and there was a ghoul on my lawn. Strangeness began to weigh on me. I had assumed, as soon as the figure saw me from the window, that they would run away and hide, and that would be it. But no, the figure seemed to be coming closer to the house. It wasn't skulking, and it wasn't threatening me. It was lurking. Maybe if I turned on the bedroom light and showed that I knew it was there, that would be the deterrent needed for ridding it from my property. I walked across the room and flicked the light switch on. The room lit up, and I ran back to the window to have another look. The figure was even closer than before, and now, with its draped arm, it was pointing with a gray hand directly at my window. I was losing my justification for staying in the house. Was I truly safe from whatever the thing was on my lawn? In all reality, how would I know what its intentions were? Maybe it meant no ill will at all. Maybe it did. Why should I presume the worst when I had not been threatened? Yes, the figure was intimidating, but was that my own macabre imagination running away with itself? I realized this notion of having the bedroom light burning was a mistake. It was not a good idea at all. I went straight back and flicked off the light. I partially pulled the curtains closed, but left a tiny slit so I could still see out onto the lawn. This would have been a good time to have powerfully bright security lights on this side of the house. I'll have them installed first thing tomorrow, I thought to myself. This was not the night I had prescribed for myself. I languished over the sound sleep I should be getting by this time of night. However, I was not at all tired nor prepared for slumber. I was the type who could go to bed with a book, read 2 pages, and be fast asleep within minutes. There would be nothing as idealistic as this fleeting thought. Sensible, yes. I must be sensible. Why not open the window and address the figure? It was still stoically stationary, like a fence post. It postured erect, unmoving, not swaying, and there was no condensation coming from its breathing. It was not warm outside, as a matter of fact. The night was chilly. Should I make contact with whoever it is? I could be overthinking the situation, overcomplicating what may not be as strange as I have imagined it to be. Such ruminations can lead to fanciful illusions. It was not out of the question to believe that maybe my imagination was getting away from me. I had to man up and deal with it. This lurker did not appear to be leaving anytime soon. How would I address it? I could yell, "Get off my lawn, weirdo!" Now that'd be too harsh. I needed to be courteous and polite. Possibly the person has a learning disability, or it had been in an accident and bumped their head. "Can I help you with something?" No, that was an invitation to engage personally. I thought it would be best not to ask it any questions. I needed to address it, but I needed to be smart, to say the right thing to drive it off my lawn without insult or threats. Thus far, there was nothing to suggest I was in mortal danger. Would this figure have already tried to get into the house if it wanted in? I mean, how hard is it really to break into a house with as many windows as this house has? I'd never broken into a house before, but I could imagine that it's no trouble at all. I had no security system installed, no dog, no extra locks on the doors and windows. My home was a 2-story house with no type of security measures at all. Maybe I should arm myself. But with what? I had no gun, pepper spray, taser, nothing that modern. I didn't even own a baseball bat. I suppose I could retrieve a butcher's knife from the kitchen. Could I honestly stab or cut another person? The thought of having to defend myself with violence sickened me. I was getting all worked up, most likely for absolutely nothing. If the person outside was going to make a move, would they not have already done so? Of course they would have. The way they're going about it is no surprise home invasion. They're clearly not afraid of being seen. That's what I'll do. I'll get my phone, take a picture of the person just to show them I have proof that they were here, being menacing. I do not believe in monsters, ghosts, or anything phantasmagorical. I knew there were no such things as aliens visiting from other planets, nor right-wing conspiracy theories. I gave no credence to any of these things, other than made-up stories, allegories from the vivid creative mind of dreamers, and high fiction induced with illusion. I took another look from my vantage point, and again, the dark figure was closer than before, mimicking itself in all stillness with one bony gray finger, which I could see more clearly now, pointing directly at me. It didn't appear that the head was raised. I had no way of knowing if this possible revenant was looking at me or not. I was feeling stung by fright. I quickly took several photos in succession. Since they failed to move at all of the photos would be identical. An emotion of impending doom rose from deep inside me. I felt my face flush red as my iambic tetrameter heart thumped to the hymn of death. This uncouth stalker seemed to be projecting its presence upon me from below. This could not be possible. I decided to turn off the bedroom light and take a couple more pictures, but this time, to get a good, clear picture, I decided to be brave enough to open the window. The lurker remained motionless as I stood in my dark bedroom window, flung open, cold wind freezing me to the bone. My hands became cold and jittery. I took several more pictures, hoping it would look up at me. Unexpectedly, with a backdrop of dull gray gloom behind it, the figure raised its head quickly and brought it back down in a bow position. In the freakish instance, I was so startled by seeing it move that I fumbled the phone in my hands, and like a football player trying to catch a fingertip pass, I clumsily and carelessly let the phone slip from my hands. My world slowed down as if time had framed this awkward picture of me, stretching with great effort out the window, trying to lay my hands back on the phone, which held the only evidence of the lurker's existence. During my moment of inept inelegance, the lurker did not even twitch. The phone fell through space and might as well have dropped into a black hole, because for me, that was the distance between inside my house and the outside world right now. I let out several expletives and jumped up and down like a child kicking the dresser and stubbing my big toe. Now, bouncing around the room on one foot while nursing my surely swollen big toe, the lurker had to be amused at my negligence. How could I have been so careless? What a freaking joke. Oh, I imagined the lurker was celebrating a victory, and this angered me. I know accidents happen, but the phone was my evidence, my lifeline. Now I couldn't even call for help. Limping to the open window, it did not collect my phone, but it was a few steps closer and remained faceless. In my frustration and idiocy, I addressed the person. "What do you want?" I was given no answer. I yelled this time. "Why are you just standing there?" Again, I was not rewarded with a response. I slammed the windows shut and locked the cold air as well as the lurker out. I walked over and sat on the side of the bed to examine my toe in the dark. It was sore and throbbed. I imagined I had broken it on the dresser. After the examination, I made my way back to the window and peeked out. He, she, it, whatever the thing was, it certainly was not here to deliver good news. I was suddenly impelled with surprise, practically pummeled by a strange alarm. I felt the need to run away. I was driven to flee the premises. I took another glance out of the window and saw that my stress was warranted, as the nameless thing was at my downstairs front door. Driven by adrenaline and terror, yes, I was being terrorized. I went at breakneck speed down the stairs as loud as a herd of buffalo, forgetting about my broken toe to the first floor. I made my way in the dark to the kitchen, which was on the backside of the house. I looked through the window of the door, and the backyard looked clear. There was no evil presence lurking that I could see. I saw nothing but the 6-foot wooden fence I'd have to scale if I were to make a clean escape. In my panic, I'd forgotten to put on my shoes or even pajama pants. I cursed to myself. I was too modest to venture out half naked. That would mean taking more time to climb the stairs and dress appropriately for the cool air of the night. I cursed again and started for the stairs. My toe throbbed, reminding me it was most definitely broken. I dared not look at the front door because I knew what lurked behind it was unimaginable. I shot up the stair like a gazelle, ignoring the pain. bounding 2 steps at a time. When I reached the top, there it stood, every bit of 7 feet tall. A dark, cloaked figure with a face too deep to read. Distraught in the gloom of hysteria, my breath became gasps. I could taste the duress of wormwood in my mouth. The malodorous stench of Gehenna filled my nostrils like burning sulfur. I heard the stridulation of wings roaring in my head, the chartless direction of my own soul, empty, lost, vanquished as I fell headlong down the stairs, breaking my cervical vertebrae, severing my spinal cord, and leaving me dead at the foot of the stairs. How was I dead, and still saw the cloaked murderer gliding down the steps and hovering over me? The cloaked lurker swelled its chest and spread its arms wide, revealing an impressive black wingspan. I could only believe this was the notorious myth folktales called Mothman. This flying humanoid creature was the most imposing thing I had ever laid eyes on. Not only was my body broken and torn, but my emotions seemed to be absent as well, for I felt no trepidation or fear. I only felt helpless. Its red eyes were merciless, and examined me as if I was going to be butchered like a pig and devoured. I suppose this was when I passed out. Darkness overtook me, and I drifted without any power of my own. Or was I being carried? I didn't know. I did get the chilling impression I was outside, for the cold nipped at my exposed body. My eyes opened. I was standing. There was no lurker anywhere around. It had vanished, disappeared, flown away silently, leaving me alone. There I stood in the backyard of a house of someone I didn't know. I was cloaked in black, soulless, emotionless, distant from who I was. I was cold, hollow, asphyxiated, without a single human sense. I'd been swallowed by the void into the dark womb of all abominations. The throb of life was absent. The pulse of warm blood had been drained. Hell had planted me firmly here. Without essence, devoid of soul, all hope abandoned, disbelief stripped me of every resistance. I was staring up at the second-floor window, where a light had just been turned on. I saw someone come to the window. It was a man. He looked worried. He looked like me. How long had I been standing here?
The footsteps of people on the platform clattered and thumped as Ariam stood in the corner with her hands clasped over her ears. She closed her eyes, hoping to reduce her anxiety. She'd always hated loud noises. Once she owned a pair of noise-canceling headphones. Those, like most things in her life, were gone. Her son, Sung-ho, stood by her side patiently. When she opened her eyes, those big, beautiful browns were staring back. He had a curiosity about him well beyond his age. Although he spoke well for 9, he'd never overcome a terrible shyness, and rarely spoke, even to his mother. What little she remembered of her home country didn't impress her. The ticket in her pocket read Texas, and she was grateful to escape the cold. She never cared for New England winters, and cared even less for Korea. Besides, how her mother spoke about it made her miss it less. Ariam checked over her shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see someone there. As she stepped through the crowd, she couldn't help feeling as if everyone were watching her. Their judgmental eyes took her in, watching her. Men in suits walked past, bumping elbows with denizens of the station. Overflowing trash cans stunk of yesterday's garbage. The cement benches in the center weren't stone gray, but riddled with graffiti, some of the images phallic in nature. Litter blue with the slight breeze. An older man sat on the floor, drumming a rhythm on an overturned bucket. This had drawn Sung-ho's attention. With that mature curiosity, he watched as the man slapped his drumstick on plastic, creating a beat. A vendor cart sat in the corner of the platform, a dingy-looking thing, once white, beaten down by age. A smiling black man stood behind it, serving hot dogs for $1 apiece. Sung-ho tugged at her sleeve and pointed to the cart, which she'd already been eyeballing herself. They hadn't eaten all day. Tied to the side of the cart were a handful of balloons placed there to draw in children. As Ariam stepped up to the cart, she observed the selection. There were only hot dogs and a few options for soda, and balloons. Sung-ho tugged at her sleeve and pointed at them. She nodded. They didn't have much money, and Texas was still long. They ordered 2 hot dogs and a balloon. Ariam smothered her dog in everything, hoping the toppings would add a little more caloric value. There weren't any available seats on the benches, which didn't bother her much. She could stand. They were going to be sitting for several hours. Ketchup had already covered Sung-ho's mouth. That boy never could keep clean. Ariam pointed at the ketchup, to which he shrugged. With a napkin, she wiped his face for him, making him squirm. They'd made short work of lunch. The dog was surprisingly good, considering she'd gotten it off a cart and for only $1. She took the time to tie the balloon around his wrist, then threw the doilies and napkins into the trash. The green balloon bounced up and down as Sung-ho ripped it out of the air and slapped it back up. Several times he did this with an obnoxious whap. To be a kid again, she thought distantly. Entertaining herself as an adult was expensive, but a cheap balloon could keep him occupied for hours. First, a strong horn blast warned of its arrival, followed by a rattle that shook the entire station. Everyone gathered in small lines. She watched this with fascination. All of these people had boarded this train numerous times before. Whack! Whack! Sung-ho slapped the balloon, missing a bald-headed man by inches. Another disapproving look from his mother got him to stop for the time being. Palming the balloon like a basketball, he moved his fingers on it, creating a squelching sound. As the vibrations of the train shook her legs, she wondered why the woman had been staring. An older woman with an expensive purse had been looking at her. Ever since childhood, she'd shied away from strangers' looks, so it wasn't that surprising that Sung-ho had picked up the same traits. The metallic screech of the brakes sent shockwaves that pierced her eardrums. She winced against the pain. The noise-canceling headphones would have done wonders. As if Sung-ho could read her mind, he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. The crowd bumped and pushed onto the train. She clung tightly to Sung-ho, desperate not to lose him. As people boarded, they trickled to their seats. Verifying with the ticket, she found their seats in the third car. They had no luggage to store. Sung-ho took the window seat, leaving her with the aisle. The man banging on the buckets outside the window stood and took a bow. A couple of people clapped, and he began gathering his things. A man in a blue suit with long, gangly fingernails walked up the aisle, stopping at each seat to ask for the tickets. The metal hole punch crunched with each one. He worked diligently, asking the occasional passenger a question or two. He feigned interest, but Ariam sensed danger. Something about him made her uneasy. As he got closer, she wondered what it was that gave her that feeling. He looked like any ordinary transit employee. Blue suit, hat, shiny shoes, and a pen. Everything looked normal, aside from his long nails. perhaps it was the confidence with which he took authority, or the smile that said, "I'm fooling all of you and you're too stupid to see it." Her hands shook as she passed the ticket. A crooked smile crossed his face, and she imagined him using those crooked teeth to bite off children's fingers. Pain erupted in her mouth as she bit into her tongue to keep from responding to that horrendous thought. The hole punch crunched. "Are you going to Texas for business or pleasure?" he asked in a slow monotone. After imagining that, she found it difficult to look him in the face. "My mother has fallen ill." With lips much too wet, the smile faded. "Sorry to hear that." He returned the ticket stub and moved to the next seat. "Business or pleasure?" his voice continued. The crunching hole punch and the visual of him biting fingers paired into one treacherous thought. She shook her head, trying to free herself from it. Before it broke free from her psyche, she imagined that spittle on his lips like blood. This is how it starts. After the door swished open, she considered what she'd said and immediately regretted it. Her superstitious mother would never have forgiven her for such a lie. Ariam did not inherit her mother's beautiful green eyes, but she did inherit that awful feeling of dread and grief. She, like many Korean people, had the Han. The lie festered beneath her skin like an infection, and the more she thought about it, the closer it got to becoming gangrenous. I wouldn't have said it under ordinary circumstances. Now that she'd put it out there, she hoped it wouldn't come true. Their family had gone through enough. An image of her mother moving through the kitchen came to mind. Her hips swung to music from the old country. Oven mitts covered her hands, a smile on her face. A beautiful vision if ever she'd had one. The smile faded. A wet, choking sound escaped her lips. Her hands ushered to her throat, and rivulets of blood spattered on the mitts. "My mother has fallen ill." Sung-ho's hand fell on top of hers, startling her from the vision. A worried look covered his face, followed by a couple of pats. He said nothing, only held her hand in silence. He read her like a book at times, and she always wondered how. Even with the comfort of her son, Ariam struggled to shake off the hallucination. She tried to calm her ravaging heartbeat, sliding deeper into the seat. Using the breathing techniques Dr. Maverick taught her, Ariam eased out of the anxiety. If things got intolerable, she could always take the pills. The lump in her pocket assured her safety net. They had a lot of time to kill and nothing to do. She didn't own a cell phone and hadn't brought anything to entertain themselves. The train clattered and Woods flashed by the window. She wanted to entertain him, even if it didn't last long. The balloon had since been forgotten, but she had to try. She held it out to him with a closed fist. Kai bai bo. At first, Sung-ho looked at her as if she were crazy. Then she bounced the fist a couple of times, and he got the gist. The first round, she'd gone paper, and he'd gone rock. In the second round, he did paper, and she switched to scissors. In the third round, she kept scissors, and he'd gone paper. They went on like this until the sun knelt behind the trees. Sung-ho leaned his head on her shoulder and watched out the window as she ran her fingers through his hair. It didn't take long before his breathing changed. The thought of her ill mother returned. She envisioned her bent over, spattering blood from her mouth, and painting the kitchen floor. After she'd said it, it became a possibility. Her hand crept over the pill bottle, but she didn't want to do that. A little longer, she told herself. She imagined someone finding her mother's body, and they too became sick. To occupy her wild imagination, Ariam observed the train car. Across the aisle seat sat an older black man with a newspaper. The light above him barely lit it, and she could tell he'd given up. It sat in his lap more as a decoration than anything. She began to think about his backstory, searching for clues, checking his shoes and his clothes, guessing approximately how much money he made. It all seemed rather boring. What she'd accessed as a teacher or an accountant wasn't good enough. Instead, she imagined him as a deacon or a religious leader of sorts. Her public school education and non-religious parents had left her incapable of telling the difference between the many denominations covering the Boston area: Lutheran, Baptist, Presbyterian. For a short period, she imagined him giving a sermon, and the cadence of his voice, or at least the one she projected on him, brought her comfort. Ahead 3 rows sat a beautiful blonde who periodically stole glances to her right. Ariam imagined an equally attractive man, probably muscular and well-dressed. The mind games were fun. By the time the train had gone dark, she'd made up backstories for everyone she could see. She'd even come up with a story for the eerie ticket man who wandered in and out of the train car. She decided he wasn't a man at all, but the bringer of death. It was his job to escort people to either heaven or hell. My mother has fallen ill. She imagined her mother lying on the floor, blood dripping from her mouth, those beautiful green eyes wide open, staring at her, knowing. Perhaps the ticket man would come to collect her. If Ariam could, she'd have called her mother and confessed. She would have begged for forgiveness, and only then she'd be free of the awful thoughts and the guilt. The door next to the car swooshed open, and she saw something. It took her a long time to determine what she'd seen or what she thought she saw. In the next car stood a man, dressed in black, holding what looked like a cane. He'd been prodding someone with it, perhaps poking them while they slept. The thought made her chuckle based on its sheer lunacy. To her left, the man coughed. An uneasy feeling raised gooseflesh on her skin. She'd just envisioned her mother hacking blood onto the kitchen floor, and now the man next to her had a tickle in his throat. Although a coincidence, she didn't like it. Then, she thought about the spread. Her foot repeatedly tapped against the floor. Sung-ho rustled off her shoulder and leaned against the window, where his breath pattered the glass. The balloon hovered freely above his head. A couple of times his eyelids flickered, as if he were in the depths of a fascinating dream. Once, she'd even sworn he'd made a noise, like a kitten's mew. The man coughed again. Ariam turned to him, hoping he was all right. What she saw instead was an increase of coughs, deeper and wetter. With a hand to his mouth, the man's eyes bulged. Desperation and confusion covered his face. A heinous chorus of croaks and gags filled the interior of the train car. A few rows ahead, more coughs erupted. The blonde woman who'd stolen glances at the hunk next to her, a hand covered her mouth. A million bizarre thoughts ran through her mind, one of them being that it, whatever it could be, might be coming in from the window. She also noticed that she wasn't coughing. The door swished open again. On the far side of the door, she saw him. Dressed completely in black, bearing a cane. He wore a mask like a bird with goggles. He used the cane to push at someone on the floor. They weren't sleeping. They were dead. Just before the door whirred closed, he looked at her. Her breath caught in her throat. The escalation of her heart rate rattled in her temples. Guilt poured over her, knowing that she'd brought this hell upon herself. Quickly, she pulled the orange bottle from her pocket and stared at the pills. She contemplated taking them and even rattled the container to see how many she had left. Instead of taking them, she pushed the bottle back into her pocket and closed her eyes. When her eyes opened, the ticket man stepped through the door. There wasn't anyone standing behind him in the next car. No bird-like mask, no goggles, and no cane. Simply the ticket man asking, business or pleasure. Their eyes met momentarily. The uneasy feeling remained, and something about him rose her defenses. The image of him biting off children's fingers returned, and the sound that echoed through her mind nearly made her cry. It sounded a bit like the snap of a carrot. Ariam clasped her hands over her ears and tried the breathing techniques again. She tried to recall all the tips Maverick had told her, but he'd always reverted back to the medication. As her thoughts cleared, the man to her left wasn't dying of a coughing fit. He'd reclined his seat the allotted 3 inches and had his hands crossed just above his potbelly. With his eyes closed, he looked peaceful. She thanked her lucky stars that it wasn't reality, but only some dimension of hell she'd glimpsed in on. One she'd probably created with that lie. She would take whatever change she had and find a payphone, or she'd beg for it if she had to. She'd call her mother and set everything straight. Riddled with anxiety, she couldn't wait until they arrived in Texas. Sung-ho moaned in his sleep, shuffling uncomfortably. She brushed his hair from his eyes and thought she'd felt warmth on his forehead. She couldn't help but feel like they'd both just suffered a nightmare. She gripped his hand and waited for the bad dream to pass. The train jostled and blasted its horn. Much to her surprise, her son didn't wake. He didn't even stir. Out the window, she saw scattered trees. Judging by the descent of speed, they were approaching another station. More than anything, she wanted to wake Sung-ho and get off the train, but they were still a long way from Texas. Although no one entered her car, the luggage clattered on board. Their voices carried through the automatic door. The windows did nothing to muffle the sounds from the platform. There were fewer people, probably because of the night. Their tired faces reflected her own. If she'd had more energy, she might have given them backstories or observed their belongings to guess at what they did for a living. Her mind had grown too tired for that. The fight to keep her eyelids open intensified. The train blasted its horn again, and it chugged to life. The people on the platform disappeared, giving way to more trees. Occasionally, they'd let up, and she'd see an intersection with a car or two or a handful of buildings. Otherwise, it remained the same. The door whirred open again, and the ticket man stepped in. He looked at all the passengers as he passed by, but said nothing. She didn't like him, didn't trust him. As he passed, a smile curled from his lips. Nothing more than a courtesy. Even that sent a chill up her spine. Her eyelids had grown heavy, and she longed for sleep, but that lingering fear kept her awake. If she closed her eyes, Ariam feared horrible dreams awaited. She could already imagine them. Her mother was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, the passengers with their bodies slumped over in the seats, or worse, spread all over the floor. She imagined this thing spreading, infecting people by the millions. Also, she knew he'd be there. He would be waiting deep in the recessions of her dreams, lurking. wearing all black with a bird-like mask, tagging along with a cane. He would be there. The worst fear was that he'd never leave. Another station and tons of miles passed. She'd regained control of her elevated heart rate and clutched tightly to the hand of her sleeping son. Above what little she could see from craning her neck, showing a palette of brightly illuminated stars. They were beautiful. With his hand in hers, she felt as if the good within him balanced out the evil she imagined in the world. He could bring balance where the chemicals in her brain could. Without him, she had no purpose, no reason to live. Darkness cast upon the train as they entered a long tunnel. Outside the window, she saw nothing but stone walls on both sides. A periodic lantern only lighted the walls outside. The ceiling lining had 2 strips of bulbs that barely illuminated the interior of the train. Ahead, the unseen hunk coughed. Not again. The door swished open, and the man came stumbling in. Thump, thump, tap. With the tip of the cane, he touched the unseen man. His leather-gloved hand raised to the mask, adjusted, and returned to his side. Thump, thump, tap. Ariam's heart pounded against the walls of her ribs. She leaned over, stealing a glance as the Birdman stepped over the hunk who'd collapsed in the aisle. He'd prodded him with the cane again, poking at his sides. The man let out an exasperated wheeze, followed by coughs that spewed blood onto the floor. Coughs sounded from the car behind her, loud ones. There seemed to be a lot of them. The man must have heard them because he moved again. Thump, thump, tap. She ducked behind the seat, hoping he wouldn't see her. A wet, obnoxious cough came from beside her. Her eyes grew wide in disbelief as she turned and looked at Sung-ho. His face had gone pale, and his eyes dark. Sweat stood out on his forehead. In the pits of his shirt, she saw stains probably caused by a fever. With a finger pressed to her lips, she silenced him. More than the illness itself, she feared he would come for them. With her eyes, she pleaded for his silence, begged for it. Maneuvering around the seat, she stole another glance at the front of the car. The man in black moved on to the beautiful blonde, who'd slumped over with her head dangling from the armrest. He pushed her head with his cane, earning a sickly groan. A whimper escaped her lips. Her hand reached to cover her mouth, but it was too late. The man in black looked up at her. His footsteps thudded against the aisle, gaining in speed and volume. Thump, thump, tap. There wasn't anywhere to run. Again, she closed her eyes. She prayed. Her eyelids clenched together as she chanted, "Don't be real. Don't be real." For a long time, she didn't dare open them. She imagined he was standing there, close to her face, waiting to scare her. When she opened them, he wasn't there. The man wasn't lying on the floor, and the woman wasn't dangling from the armrest either. The fear of those delusions grew. It seemed that each time she imagined him, he got closer. At her side, Sung-ho looked fine. He'd jostled in his sleep again. He remained asleep, and his breath had fogged the window just a little more. As desperately as she could, she clung to reality. If she allowed her imagination to trail, things would get worse. Ariam didn't know exactly what would happen if he reached her, if anything at all. But she didn't want to find out. Luckily, the man across the aisle had closed his eyes. Otherwise, he'd have witnessed her panic and call the police. Then they'd find her and drag her back there. Within those walls, she wasn't allowed to see Sung-ho. They made sure of it. After talking herself off the ledge, an ounce of comfort came over her. She knew that the hallucinations wouldn't go on forever. If she needed them to go away badly enough, she could always use the safety net. I'm just going to rest my eyes. She leaned back in her chair and pushed the horrendous thoughts from her mind. The fear that he'd return tortured her. A distant fear that he might be lurking in her dreams also swept over her. She listened carefully for his footsteps, but heard little over the clanging train. The man wasn't real. Of that she was certain. But she knew her imagination could be her worst enemy. She could imagine all sorts of horrific scenarios, and they regularly felt indistinguishable from reality. As a young girl, that imagination had been her best friend. Before she grasped English, she'd had no friends except those in her head. A light sleep came over her, but no nightmares waited. A couple of hours passed, and her eyes opened to the orange glow breaking on the horizon. With the sun came a sense of ease. Less bad things happened in the daylight. Much to her surprise, Sung-ho was already awake. He'd taken her hand in his and sat staring out the window, as he'd done before. He too looked mesmerized by the sunrise. The balloon drifted above his head, forgotten. A gurgling erupted in her stomach. The hot dogs had long since burned off, and she was hungry again. There had been a cafe car somewhere on the train, and she wondered if she could find it. As she shuffled through her pockets, she concluded there wasn't enough money. They'd have to wait. Sung-ho kicked his feet back and forth off the edge of his seat. This made her smile. Much like she'd done with English, she studied him carefully. With a boy as painfully shy as him, she'd learned to pick up on his body language. That little nap did nothing to repair the exhaustion from the trip, but she knew they'd sleep when they got there. The brakes screeched again, followed by the blare of the horn. Ahead was another train station. Outside, she watched as people walked freely about the city. They looked happy. Most of them. The train hissed as it came to a stop, and she saw them on the platform, waiting to board. Thump, thump, tap. As if in slow motion, the doors sprung open. People started to board the train. He stood at the front of her car, hanging onto his cane, watching her. His hands rested on the brass notch on top of the cane. She looked out the window to her right, down at the platform. The people waiting in line had changed. Starbucks cups weren't gripped firmly in their hands anymore. They weren't happy morning people on their commute. The flesh around their mouths had split and dangled. The skin hung loosely from their bones like lepers. An emotionless, peeling mask had replaced the life that had once shone from their faces. These people brushed past the man in black as they boarded. With them came the pungent odor of death. Their feet dragged as they crept towards their seats. Maggots squirmed within the gaping holes of their skin as parts of their bones and organs shone through the various wounds. Sung-ho's hand overlapped hers. She turned and looked at him. His eyes left hers for a second, stealing a glance over the seat. She suspected he was looking at the man in black. The boy's face turned into a grimace. If you take your medicine, the monsters will go away. The train jerked to life. Its powerful engine chugged. The lump in her pocket reminded her of the way out,
But she didn't think she needed it. She firmly believed she could hold on a little longer. Sung-ho squeezed her hand tighter, encouraging her. Again, she shook her head. Why not? With trembling hands, Ariam wiped away tears. If I take them, you'll go away too.
One. The Gift. On my 8th birthday in 1968, I got an odd birthday gift. I was certain everything it represented was true, and I was quick to ask it questions as I awaited the triangular answer to appear in its purplish-blue form underneath its black round body. The magic 8-ball, about the size of a softball, somehow held the magic to predict my future in simple answers to only yes and no questions. It is decidedly so. Ask again later. Better not tell you now. Cannot predict now. It is certain. You may rely on it. There were 20 possible answers, 10 affirmative, 5 non-committal, and 5 negatives. I was no mathematician, but the odds always seemed good that I should receive the answer I hoped for. For the most part, though, those hopeful answers usually eluded me. Trina wasn't in love with me. I wasn't going to get that mini bike like my best friend Randy got. I would also be forced to finish my school career without escaping by writing a #1 bestseller or be discovered on the junior high baseball diamond to become a professional pitcher. I never put stock in the negative answers, but held strong prospects for the positive ones. If I would have had money, I would have bet it all at my young age on what the 8-ball had to say. As I continued to grow up, like all toys purchased and given to me as birthday gifts, my once prized magic 8-ball finally found its home retired to the brown cardboard box filled with other short-lived Hasbro games and metal collectible cars once garnering my unrelenting attention, however short it was. I didn't see the magic 8-ball for many years as that box remained in the farthest reach underneath my bed where all monsters lived, only to come out at night to make their scary sounds and create many moments that rattled throughout the night. 2. Summer of 1978. I dreaded going through my things, an eclectic collection of my life getting laid out across my bed to either be taken with me off to school or packed away and taken to the basement. My folks were excited about me choosing creative writing as a major with journalism as a minor. My mom always loved writing. She was a published poet, and my grandmother on her side had written a 2-volume book on her life and times. It seemed possible the gift of writing was in my genes. My grandfather on her side was a preacher and gave what I recall very deep and thought-out words of wisdom filled with faith. I had chosen the small college in our hometown to attend. It hadn't made the list of schools turning out winning war correspondents like Neil Sheehan or novelists such as J.D. Salinger or Ernest Hemingway, but it was a chance for a kid from an average blue-collar family fighting to keep their house payment made and food on the table for 6 kids, a chance to break the mold and get a diploma from a good, solid college. In the middle of those nerve-wracking thoughts of my future while sorting out things of my past, I got down on my knees to survey the collection of forgotten junk kept hidden from sight underneath the bed I'd spent sleeping on since I can remember. In the farthest reach of the corner, swallowed by the darkest shadows, sat a dusty brown cardboard box, tucked away like a pirate's chest full of booty. I stretched my arm as far as possible, attempting to contact its edge using the tips of my fingers. I eased closer, my body now halfway underneath the frame of the bed until the feel of gritty, dry cardboard finally met the touch of my skin. I slid in a tad farther before a firm grip was made. Slowly backing out and tugging the slightly weighty box along with me, each elbow digging into the carpet, aiding and pushing myself backwards from the tight opening. I wondered what was contained inside. When I finally sat kneeling at the edge of my bed, I lifted the newly found treasure using both hands and held it up in the light. I inhaled a large breath of air and then in one strong puff blew the loose dust from its folded closed top. One flap held over the other which had sealed it shut. I should have known its contents, I supposed, but I didn't. Every child has a special hiding place for secret things, and I imagine this must have been mine, although I didn't recall having it. I placed the discovery on top of my bed amongst the other piles of things from my past to further inspect. Carefully pulling at one corner of the box, gently tugging at the focal point where the flaps overlapped, the box unfolded, mimicking the lens of a camera's aperture, opening its exposure ever wider. My attention became very focused while I attempted to recall the items that I had placed within its confinement so many years ago. I believe my heart rate even increased, slightly above normal, as the opening became wide enough to clearly see inside. My smile grew exponentially across my face as my mind, now captured by a cascade of flooding memories, overwhelmed at what my eyes now saw and recognized. Sitting in the left-hand corner of the box, mixed amongst scattered Hot Wheels and Matchbox cars, sat my very dangerous set of clackers. The mere sight of the rock-hard, brightly colored red plastic balls leashed together by a thin white rope quickly brought the painful memory of swollen wrists painted with blackened bruises, ushering in tears as large as the magic 8-ball nestled in and proudly resting above the other assorted toys and trinkets. Ah, the masterful lies of the magic 8-ball, I reminisced. The brainchild of the Brunswick Billiard Company. The huge conglomerate that sells the lies of many childhood dreams that never come true as predicted. Girls who were supposed to fall in love with boys that didn't, fortunes promised to be made, and dreams of fame which never bloom into reality. All those lies that lay heavy on a child's heart, creating a myriad of future mental issues, all for the profit of some CEO exec. Whatever brings the cash, enabling him to purchase another yacht or beachside home, no matter the cost of shattered youthful dreams being crushed. That's when the recollection of one specific question wafted into my mind and gently settled into the foggy topic of the moment with a thunderous thud. I sat back, my body propped against the wall below the window, gently resting my head against the painted horsehair plaster and gently closing my eyes to replay the last question I had asked. The one the 8-ball answered just before I tucked it neatly away with all the other worn out and broken souvenirs from my childhood to be retired into storage and forgotten. Magic 8-ball. Will I ever be famous? I gently shook the 8-ball several times as instructed before revealing its answer. I now remembered the day precisely as it happened. It was way back when I was 12 years old. I had kept the black round birthday gift with the white encircled number 8 boldly displayed like a badge of honor out on the shelf for almost 4 years to the day I had unwrapped it way back. I was down in the dumps on that particular day because I was told I had to clean up my room immediately. William Gregory Mansfield, I've asked you for the final time. Your grandparents are coming to celebrate your birthday tomorrow, and I want that cluttered room of yours straight as an arrow before they get here, young man. If it's not, we'll just skip your birthday celebration this year. No presents or cake. I knew she meant business with the threat of skipping my birthday. Mom loved family celebrations even more than us kids, but today I needed a celebration. The girl I thought I was in love with dumped me Friday afternoon just before the last school bell rang. I knew what the blues were all about now, and to top things off, I now had to work in my room cleaning like a chained prisoner from the work camp, clearing all the weeds along the highway. I looked up and saw the magic 8-ball just sitting on the shelf. I picked it up, first thinking I'd open my window and just chuck it out to the street, watching the dang thing explode and shatter into pieces. It had lied to me so many times in my past. It held no value anymore, only harsh reminders of things that never came to be. I unlashed the window locks and pushed up with all my strength, breaking the seal of paint that held the window tightly closed. After expending most of my strength and frustration getting the window open, I looked out and saw my friends playing tag in the quiet intersection, our usual spot to meet. I lost the feeling of anger in a flash and instead looked down at the dusty black round ball with the white circle and black numeral 8 on it. I decided to ask it one last question before stowing it away in the cardboard box already full of junk from past birthdays and Christmases. After asking those 5 simple words once more, will I ever become famous? I continued to shake it before slowly turning the bottom upward where the answer would be revealed to me in its purplish blue triangle. It is decidedly so. I briefly stared at the answer before letting out a sarcastic guffaw. Yeah, right, my ass. I looked down one last time before stowing the stupid toy away, which now brings me to the day I rediscovered it on my way to packing up my room for college. I once again picked up the ball of untruths and repeated the same question, knowing it would likely reveal a different answer this time since it was merely a toy of chance. After asking the same question years earlier, I repeated it word for word. Will I ever become famous? I turned it over, readying myself for yet another resounding guffaw from disgust. It is decidedly so. I laughed out loud before finishing what I had started to do years ago and should have done all along. I opened the window, which opened much easier in my older and more physically fit shape. Seeing no one out front, I grabbed the softball-sized black plastic toy and chucked it out as high as I could towards the intersection of the asphalt streets. With a much quieter bang when it hit solid ground than I expected, it splintered off into several pieces before what was left rolled awkwardly to the curb catty-cornered from our house. It wobbled several sickly lopes before entering the storm sewer opening and disappearing into the darkness forever gone from my sight. That would be the end of the story of my birthday gift's life and recollections, if not for where I found myself many years later. 3. The Trip, 2024. I've always been the guy who finds himself driving by old stomping grounds or my home I grew up in an attempt to relive moments from my past. I like the feeling of remembering. It's like a drug calling out to me, demanding I answer the call. Melancholy is a feeling I embrace and am very comfortable with. Reflective times. Moments spent calculating my choices and where they have led me. I'm generally a happy person, but I do find myself sometimes dwelling amongst sadness. I've never felt I am out of control, though. I can turn these feelings of sorrow on and off like a light switch, which is why I wasn't alarmed at first when a slightly newer but stranger version of this swept over me. That was before the magnitude of it overtook my ability to maintain control and completely swallowing me into its captivity, much like a caged bird. The walls began closing in on me. I was with my wife, son, and her parents as we sat in a restaurant set in nostalgic 70s style. Pop art on the walls like Andy Warhol, album covers framed from bands like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Joe Cocker. I'd been fine, I thought at first. It was just the heat affecting me. We laughed at some of the displays, such as the vintage yo-yo sign and lava lamps oozing their goo from the top then dropping down to the bottom of the colored water. I was happy and talkative just moments before everything changed. Suddenly, I felt like I was sitting before a giant living postcard. There was movement within the picture, but it felt like a Picasso painting of somewhere I had been before but couldn't quite remember when or where I was. Deja vu with an eerie twist. As I sat, attempting to fake a feeling of normality so no one would worry, when in truth I was sailing far overhead peering down at the scene from above. I felt a feeling of fear I'd never known before. I'm the guy that doesn't panic, yet I felt a horribly unfamiliar feeling setting in. I'm the guy who rarely feared anything, but I was frozen with a strong, uncomfortable apprehension in an instant. I feared I was losing control of myself as everything from what I saw, smelled, and tasted seemed new and unknown, foreign and very unworldly from the place I was from. I was in another world running parallel with the universe everyone else was in, lost in the cosmos, yet in enough control to nod my head to the conversation that was being discussed as if I remained focused in it, which I was not. Their language became foreign, syllables rolling off their tongues in tones I had never before heard. My first thought was that someone had slipped something in my drink or laced my food with LSD. I certainly was poisoned either with purpose or possibly accidentally. Should I say something? Shall I let my family know I may possibly be in trouble? I didn't want to cause panic or make a scene. I tried to ascertain if I were the only one in the restaurant experiencing the oddities I was. Would I recognize the signs if they were? I was clueless. "William, are you okay?" My wife's voice sounded distant and echoey, as if we were deep in a cavern and she had called out to me from across a distance, her words losing their volume as they bounced from wall to wall before reaching me. I strained to decipher what I was barely hearing in one moment, yet almost screaming in my ear the next. "William, your forehead is dripping with sweat. Are you hot? Your face is flush. Take a drink of cold ice water, honey." I wanted to answer her, but I couldn't make any words exit my mouth, feeling as if cotton balls were encrusted on the inside of my cheeks. My tongue, thick and gooey, caused me to fear any attempts at talking would come out garbled and sounding like a toddler's gibberish. Her voice echoed again, only much louder before fading off into a whisper. "William, do you hear me?" I saw people looking our way to the table we sat. I was sitting in my seat, but also seeing the scene from above, and then several other different angles and perspectives of the room. Am I having a heart attack or stroke? Is a seizure going to drop me to the floor? My eyes scanned the room, and though the scenery moved quickly like snapshots in one of those old-time machines that looked like a stop-action film when you cranked the handle and peered into the binocular eyepieces, I was able to focus on every detail, yet nothing but a blur all at once. Voices kept mixing. My wife's, my in-laws, and my son's, along with a myriad of unfamiliar ones. It was like an orchestra playing sheet music filled with human verbiage in harmony, yet I could make out individual words like solos. It was maddening, and internally I begged it to cease. My eyes caught a black blur, and I somehow focused upon it. It was a goddamned magic 8-ball. The sight of it brought a second of calm before I noticed the glue and cracks showing it had been repaired. It couldn't possibly be. I was now 64 years old, close to 5 decades since I had hurled that damned black 8-ball from the second story of our house. It had flown from my own hand and onto the paved road. I had seen it explode into several pieces with my own eyes. What was happening? Had I angered my maker and now being punished? My wife, our son, and I were visiting her folks where they now lived. A fairly quiet and artsy community that was 3 states away from the house I grew up in and had thrown the toy from its window. Impossible. There was no way the 8-ball I was looking at was the one and the same. The calm from the sight of it now speedily went from confusion to full-blown panic. I started blabbing words, trying to explain the thoughts going through my head. I knew by the look in their eyes I was speaking sentences they were unable to understand. The possibilities of what this whole scenario could mean kept bouncing in and out of my mind like a tennis ball in a heated match. My wife's parents looked at me as if I were a crazed person, suffering a psychotic episode, and the look in their eyes caused me to close within tightly and enter self-preservation mode. I went silent and waited for the explosion. I knew it was coming. What in the world was happening to me? Had aliens snatched me up and done experiments on my brain and then reinserted me back into my world to see what would happen? I've never doubted myself and the world I lived in until this very moment. I didn't know who or what to trust. Was my brain suffering a chemical reaction causing me to doubt my existence? The walls kept closing in tighter. Is this what a mental breakdown consists of? Who could help me or explain this to a point it made sense and give me calm to the lack of control I was feeling? I pictured the movie The Matrix and imagined I had been hooked up to the machine feeding the alien and giving it life up to the point I had broken free and realized what was happening. Now it had turned on me and was attempting to snuff my existence from its web. Either that, or I was clinically insane and suffering a massive meltdown. I just couldn't concentrate enough to define which was more plausible. "Calm down, William. We are all here to help you." My wife's lips spoke with a quiet, reassuring tone I couldn't make myself believe. Just words to trick me into letting my guard down so I could be taken out. My son chimed in behind her. "Dad, it's okay. We got you. You're going to be all right." Again, the voice I heard seemed as if it were scripted and forced. The effect was not sufficient to slow my rapid breathing or lull me into any form of calm. I attempted to inhale slow, long, and deep breaths, filling my lungs to their capacity so I would build the strength to cut and run, but it didn't help. I was much too weak now. I looked at the familiar faces around the table, people I should trust, but now couldn't. My focus widened to others at tables around the room who continued staring in shock. They all wore the likeness of out-of-focus circus clowns, their faces molded into rubbery, distorted Halloween masks, letting eking, hissing noises escape from their rubber lips that were oversized and flopping about. Escape. That is the only thought that continually raged through my mind. I felt as if I were a trapped rodent in the corner of a room filled with hungry killer cats ready to pounce upon me at any moment to shred and feed on my torn and clawed flesh. I feared becoming their fodder, overloaded on catnip, forcing them to react in crazy, unexpected movements. I ascertained the only feasible thing to do was to force myself up and run as fast as I possibly could over anything or anyone who got in my way. I was terrified. Hovering above every thought that came and went was the same line in my head. It is decidedly so. It is decidedly so. Is this what would make me famous? Flipping out in a public place and possibly being gunned down in the parking lot as I escaped the scene by some trigger-happy, overzealous rookie on the force deeming me a threat to society? A moment later, I couldn't feel a thing. My body stiffened and the lights went out. As quick as someone throwing the main breaker on a fuse box, I was out cold, memory deleted. When I woke up, I had no idea where I was. I assumed a mental institution. I'd written about one down south during my investigative reporting days. The atrocities which had been taking place for years was abhorrent. Would I now be an unfortunate soul getting experimented on and given drugs to turn me into a zombie? A crazed tool of war for the army? Maybe I was already drugged and the feelings of panic I was experiencing were part of some research project I'd been enrolled in against my will. This feeling, this trying to recollect a memory that didn't feel like mine now felt fake or implanted. Was I even real anymore? Was I ever? While I no longer seemed to be suffering panic, I was overwhelmed by a deep feeling of being lost or deserted. Left behind like a sole survivor floating in the middle of an ocean, all alone and clueless of how long I'd been adrift or where I was. If not for the constant lapping of the calming waves against the raft which held me, I knew the anxiety would begin attacking once more. A faint memory of being a once happy-go-lucky and mediocre journalist, I now was uncertain if anything inside my brain was real or maybe I had become nothing but a collection of tissue, cells, and brain matter with absolutely no purpose here other than be trapped within a question mark. Like Pinocchio, I want to be real again. I want to be a real boy. Not a wooden puppet forced to do the bidding of some unseen controller hidden behind a cloak of darkness. "Mr. Mansfield?" The man in the white medical coat spoke. "Mr. Mansfield, over here, sir." He snapped his finger, drawing my blank attention. "We've been doing some blood tests, and—" "Who are you?" I asked. Where am I? My family." "Mr. Mansfield, you are at the Central City University Hospital. I'm Dr. Albert Kander, and your family, your wife, son, and folks, are in the waiting room anxiously awaiting to hear how you are doing. You arrived here by ambulance after experiencing a breakdown of sorts. We are running some tests to see what possibly brought this event on." He continued talking, but his words became a string of foreign gibberish to me, much just like before the lights went out. I lost my attention span for him the minute I heard him say the entire episode played out in under 5 minutes, and my family was waiting to see me when he gave them the all clear. I knew the episode lasted far more than 5 minutes. Worlds could be created in the time I spent down the rabbit's hole. Words I didn't even know I had heard before began to form questions in my mind, and I suddenly began speaking, asking. "A breakdown? High anxiety? Really?" I questioned, not believing something so simple falling from his mouth could explain away my gut-wrenching episode of what I saw as two worlds colliding into a cataclysmic catastrophe. "How do I know I haven't been poisoned? Will this happen to me again?" I asked in a demanding and defiant tone. "Have you been under any undue pressure lately? Work, at home, anything you can recall?" "Nothing like that. I can't think of a thing. I'm usually scared of nothing, but I've never felt so fright-filled and helpless, totally out of control of my surroundings, my thoughts, my actions." The doctor interrupted me and asked, "At any time, did you feel like causing any bodily harm to yourself or anyone else?" "Are you kidding me?" I know my face was beginning to redden. I could feel the heat and the pulsing and pumping of blood through the veins in my temples. Is the government forcing you to ask these questions? Absolutely not. I've never wanted to hurt anybody or myself. No, I haven't been having troubles at home or work. This came on like a runaway freight train from nowhere. One minute I'm sitting with my family enjoying a meal. The next second my brain is filled with fear and confusion as I watch everyone around me become melting cartoon people. My breathing began to become labored. I just want to be back to normal. I desperately sucked for air, unable to feel like my lungs were filling to capacity. I never saw the nurse coming around to the side of my bed. I never felt the needle stick as she apparently shoved the medication into my vein. All I felt was a flooding and euphoric calm rush over me as the faces smiled, their hands waving goodbye to me as if I were aboard a giant cruise ship waving bon voyage to those left behind on the dock. Lulled into a fantasy world that felt safe and warm, fuzzy and cute, but not real, not the world I belonged in. Suddenly, I sank into blackness filled with empty silence, all alone, frozen in time. 4. Life continues. Being a writer from an early age, I always enjoy any library, especially one new to me. I was thrilled at the thought of being able to visit the Library of Congress for the first time in my life. While the magic 8-ball of my youth had fed me lies of me one day being famous, I had been afforded a wonderful life fulfilling my dream of being a journalist. The newspaper I worked for my entire career up until and including today was very rewarding. I had received several accolades along the way and assumed this was the level of fame the black plastic ball of foretelling knowledge was, well, foretelling. I held no great disappointments in the way my life was turning out. Retirement was around the corner as I was coming up on the age of 65. My wife and I were looking forward to seeing the country from one end to the other, bottom to top, while traveling it in the comfort of an RV. I was looking forward to possibly working on my memoirs to seal up the good life I had led and possibly share what I had learned along the way. Literary fiction called out to me, and I felt I had a few stories and books inside my head before my ultimate departure from Earth. There was, of course, like anyone else's life and marriage, a few ups and downs and unseen obstacles to be traversed, but PATRON and I had found love in each other along with our fair share of happiness and unusually good health. This would be my first trip up on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. I was given the gift of visiting the Library of Congress as a retirement perk from the company I'd worked for my entire career. The library's campus was made up of 3 separate buildings, and upon entering it, it instantly felt as if it would be the pinnacle of my career. I was excited to say the least as I walked through the large entryway. That excitement quickly transformed into pure awe as I began to visually take in all the majesty of its size. Hundreds, if not thousands of shelves and books displayed. The room echoed with silence, but one knew all the volumes perched staunchly upright side by side held words from all the varying imaginations of authors and time. Within that silence, there certainly must be the hum and rumble of all the words contained within all the inked pages, scrambling about to be heard and read. My heart began to pulse heavier as if prodded to do so by all the authors represented. In this first moment of being overwhelmed while imagining the collection of hours it had taken to fill all the pages in all the books portrayed, I knew full well how long it had taken me, myself, to write the manuscripts I had written. A great portion of my life was sitting at a table tapping away in silence alone while my family graciously and patiently put up with my absence. I was suddenly reminded by the 4 simple words which had somehow haunted me my entire life from the day I unwrapped that damn birthday present on the celebration of my 8th year of life. It is decidedly so. How in the world this ridiculous string of words has stuck with me in my memory bank for almost 57 years puts me beside myself. I swear when I even think of them, I see them in that purplish blue triangle inside my head, taunting me with the lies the Brunswick Billiard Company filled me with, telling me I would be famous as if I were ludicrous to even doubt it. I had spent my childhood believing I would become famous, and all because of a black plastic 8-ball designed to make a company millions of dollars by placing false hopes and dashed dreams into 20 separate random lies. My heart began to throb, and the memory of a family dinner gone bad years and years ago did nothing to ease the oncoming sensation building within. There must be a devil trapped inside me, born to perpetuate these unwarranted attacks of panic contained inside my body and soul. I looked up at the shelves towering above and below me. I was surrounded by words. Their leather-bound spines began to glimmer in and out of focus as they trembled on the shelves as if attempting a massive breakout. If I were to die at this moment, the thought of being trampled by or drowning in the hundreds of years of written words from famous writers, spilling their thoughts and dreams over my bones or into my lungs after being freed from their captive stark white pages, well, there could be far worse ways to die inside my thoughts. "Excuse me, sir?" 3 words from a stranger somehow broke through the chasm of thoughts circling inside the structure of my mind, and I turned to answer. "Yes?" "I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but..." The younger gentleman, possibly college-aged, nervously attempted to gather his thoughts before continuing. "I'm certain you've probably heard this 100 times before, but you look dead spot on, like W.G. Mansfield, if he were to be your age, of course." All the internal scrambling within my brain came to an abrupt halt instantly, like the dead calm after the lightning bolt strikes the tree and splinters it before your eyes. I smiled. "Why, young man, I am W.G. Mansfield. William Gregory Mansfield, in fact." "The W.G. Mansfield?" he asked, almost as if he were in disbelief. "The only one I know." I smiled and laughed whimsically. But he's famous." "Well, I'm not aware of any fame of mine." "And he's been dead for 20 or so years." I was stunned. I felt a pain so deep within my heart I wasn't sure if its beating would continue. I was speechless, not knowing how to respond. Had a wasp dropped into my shirt and stung my chest? "His books are up on the 4th floor, sir. Would you like me to show them to you?" I must have changed color to a ghostly white because the young man held out his hand to aid my now trembling body. I felt as if I had aged 20 years in an instant. I wasn't sure if it were the news of being famous or being told I had died 20 years earlier, but I did take his hand and begin to follow. "Is this some kind of intricate joke you play on visitors here?" I asked. "No, sir, not at all. I've been most fascinated by the writings of Mansfield," he responded, as if were ignoring the fact I had told him who I was. He led me to an elevator, and as the door closed and the journey upward began, he started to speak again. "I've read them all, at least twice." I saw a twinkle in his eyes, if he were gloating with pride of his achievement. "I, of course, have my favorite." "Tell me, what name do you go by?" I questioned. Tim Gallo. I'm a junior at Georgetown University. English major with a journalism minor." "Well, Tim Gallo, that is a very challenging choice you've made. It sounds almost as familiar as déjà vu to me," I answered, while attempting to decipher the entire matter of circumstance I was now encased in, wondering exactly what books this young man was taking me to see. "It's just uncanny, sir, how much you look like him. Like I was saying, I do have a favorite, the slaying of demons." I finished his sentence. "Yes, sir, brilliant work. I've read it 4 times and was thinking about starting it again. I just hate it was his last book." "How in the world did you find it? I was never able to find a publisher that would look at it with any seriousness." The young Tim Gallo looked over at me with a coy smile before continuing. His wife, Katrin, had his first book he had ever written, Where the 8-Ball Lies, published about a year after his death. 2005 Penguin Random House, went bestseller within 2 weeks. "I'll be a son of a..." The bell chimed and a digital voice announced, "4th floor," as the door slid open. My mind was returning to the mad spin, the swirling madhouse it was before Tim Gallo stepped in and added the finishing blow. I couldn't understand what was happening. It made no sense at all. I know I didn't hear him wrong or misunderstand his date. He said 2005, a year after I presumably died. But I was here. I was alive. That would have put my death 20 years earlier. What was happening? The real quandary to this entire thing was, I hadn't written my first book until 2018. How could it have been published 13 years before I ever even began writing it? I looked around while carefully observing anyone who was near us, looking for perked ears or people far too concerned with our conversation. There must be cameras hidden somewhere. This had to be some intricate joke conceived by one of my co-workers as a retirement gag or something. Either that, or Dr. Kander had missed the ticket by a long shot. Maybe I was clinically insane, but somehow still a functioning madman, like an alcoholic who was able to cope with daily life. Whatever it was, I needed to slip out and call Katrin before this escalated into something out of my control. Tim gave my arm a gentle tug, steering me to the left and down between a row of 7 or 8 tier shelving. Book after book, title after title began dizzying me. "It's up here, not much farther, Mr. Mansfield." He obviously didn't believe I was who I claimed to be, even though he had been the one who stated I looked like an exact replica of the famous author. He suddenly stopped and reached up to the 3rd shelf from the top and drug his pointing finger down a line of spines until it stopped. His fingertips slid to the top and hooked the book, pulling it in an angle toward him until he could grip it with his full hand. "Here it is. The Slaying of Demons. The creme de la creme of writing." Tim opened the book and began to read. "'Twas neither truth nor—" I joined him in the speaking out loud as I stood too far from the page to read. "Nor lie when the demon spoke. It was mere smartly crafted words from its forked tongue, and they stuck to me as if coated in paste and fire. My ears became heated as his callous sentiment tumbled through the stench-filled air and entered the canals of my ears. It was at this point my skin became singed. I knew this beast within brought me no goodwill and must be slayed." Tim looked up at me in awe. "I can go on, if you like?" I asked. "You really are him, aren't you?" He quickly flipped to the last pages of the hardbound book in his hand, the author's page. There at the top was a picture of W.G. Mansfield. Tim looked down at it, studied it momentarily, and then returned to my face and once more glanced at the picture as he pulled the book closer to his eyes. He reached over and gently brushed the longer graying hair across my forehead over to one side, revealing the same dark-tinted birthmark in the same spot on the forehead of the picture. "How can it be?" he asked. I looked at him and shrugged in shared question. "I have no idea. As far as I've known, this book and all my others are only files stored on my laptop. I'd thought about indie publishing them back when I wrote them, but knew my marketing skills would get them nowhere. I really wrote my own pleasure. Therapy. My self-medication to slay the demons that lay dormant most of the time. I always felt as if I could rid myself of them by exposing them on paper for others to see someday. I had been foretold I would be famous one day, but I never believed. Mr. Mansfield, these..." "Please, Tim, call me William. I think we've come far enough now, even though it's been a very short time, to be on a first-name basis." "Okay, William. These books of yours they're brilliant. They are moving, telling, even teaching. You deserve the fame. You've earned the shelf your works now sit here in the Library of Congress. I've gotten more out of your writing than I have in 3 years of my classes. I can't believe I'm talking to you, let alone being able to call you William." My eyes surely showed the confusion I felt. "Tim, I appreciate your kindness, but I don't even know if I'm truly alive or not. It all makes no sense. I don't even know if my wife is still where I left her at home. I saw her 2 days ago, but is that 100 years in present time? Where has time gone? Am I stuck in a world that seems woven between reality and fiction? If I'm supposedly dead, what did I die from? And where's my body buried? Mr. Mansfield? William? Tim slowly flipped the author's page over, revealing more on the back. He held the book out toward me to read. If you really want to know, it's on this page. My hand shook as I grasped the bound volume in my hand. I hesitated, not knowing if I were mentally ready to read the circumstance of my demise. If I were truly dead, how could I lift and hold this leather-bound, 80,000-word literary fiction within my grasp now? Ghosts can't defy the force of gravity pulling downward, not being a ghost merely visible as a mist gathered in the air, an image with no substance. I took the copy and held it in my hands, lightly dragging my fingertip over its shiny leather finish. I could feel the bumps and cracks stamped into the leather. If I were truly a ghost, I would imagine any sensations such as this impossible. As I studied the cover, I noticed it contained no image like the cover I had created for it. It bore merely the title at the top in what appeared to be gold leaf lettering and W.G. Mansfield across the bottom in the same. I stared at it, almost forgetting that Tim was standing nearby watching. My gaze moved around the room, realizing all the history nestled within. The hundreds, if not thousands, of writers' works stored together for others to pull from the shelves and savor. The Magic 8-Ball had somehow been more than just a silly toy created by a huge conglomerate to pad their bank accounts and financial portfolio. It hadn't been the demon I had made it out to be, one designed to merely haunt my existence with falsehoods throughout my life. It was so much more. It was a world of its own held inside the black plastic encasement for reasons I would never truly understand. Had it been given to me to let me know my life would not be a waste or go unnoticed and without recognition? Had it been the tool designed to aid in the legacy I would leave behind? Standing right here next to me was a living example of a life I had never previously known, but was touched by words I put together in a string that talked to him, spoke to him in ways that he understood and instilled value to him. I became lightheaded, attempting to absorb it all in. The demon of doubt within me was also swaying inside my head. I could feel him beginning to falter. Tim must have noticed and slowly walked me over to a table in the middle of the large reading room. There were others sitting at tables a distance from us, heads buried in books held in their hands or laid flat upon the tables. They appeared to be feeding their brains, letting the matter within soak up the writings of someone fortunate enough to have been given a home for their works to live and remain alive through the tests of time, giving knowledge and thought-provoking ideas to ponder. I wasn't sure how I could ever pull myself away from this odd trap my brain appeared to be caged within. It wasn't scary like before. There was a pleasance this time. It felt like I was at home in a warm leather reading chair with the light shining down in the perfect mix of tone and spectrum. Cozy, comforting, and anxiety-free. I wanted to know what the next page read, what it held in words, the language I loved most, explaining what had happened. But I was so at ease, I wasn't certain I wanted to risk losing this fragile moment I was encased in. I did long to hear my wife's voice, though I had heard it just this morning over the phone when she called to wish me well on my visit to the library. It seemed warmer than usual now that I think upon it, but I took no real notice of any difference at the time. Now that conversation seems so distant, as if years had passed since her words sounded melodical to my ears. Her voice always gave me comfort. Even when spoken in anger, I knew she would always love me. I needed to hear her voice again. I had to know she was alive and still remembered me and the love we shared between us. I stepped out and away from the people concentrating on their books and would call to say hello, tell her how much I love her, and then say goodbye as if it were the last time. Then I'd come back and read how I was taken from this world and moved to the next level. 5. Goodbyes are never easy. The phone rang twice before I heard the magic of her hello. I was quick to say I love you to her. William? She quickly spoke before a tone of doubt crept into her voice. Who is this? It's me, sweetheart, your loving husband. The line went deathly quiet. I don't know who this is, but it's not funny. How did you get this number? She questioned. William is not here. He will never be here again. Sweetheart, it's me, William. I just wanted to hear your voice. I needed to hear you and let you know I love you. William? It can't be. It's not really you. You're gone. You've been gone for so long. Sniffles took the place of her confused and saddened words. I instantly felt my heart breaking. I knew now what I had dreaded reading. It was true. I was no longer a part in this world, in her world. I felt the crack that I knew lay dormant for some time grow wider. I'd been so careful to nurse it so it wouldn't spread any further. I felt that crack widening as my heart continued to break as I listened to the tears and sighs on the other end of the line we were connected by. I knew my time with her was very short. A sixth sense, I suppose. It is me, Katrin. I know I can't explain. I just wanted you to know that I do love you, and I'm okay now. I'm at peace. I finally slayed the demon, honey. It's dead and gone. The phone line went dead after she whispered, I love you too, William. I slowly walked back into the room and sat down where my book, The Slaying of Demons, lay open to the page I feared would send me away to some other place I wasn't prepared to go. At least at this moment, I knew I could call and hear my wife's name. I could nestle into a warm leather chair and read any author my heart desired. This library could be my heaven. I wasn't sure if I'd be sent to another pleasant spot, or possibly hell, or some horrible derivative of such. If only I now held that magic 8-ball, I could ask it and know before I took the risk of reading the last paragraph. Tim looked at me as if he knew I had a great challenge facing me. I wasn't sure if he was just that perceptive or if he was somehow a bigger part of this than I knew. Maybe, just maybe he was a guardian angel sent to usher me into the next world. If I were supposed to be informed ahead of time, the 8-ball would be sitting on the table beside my book, and it wasn't. It must be a sign of choosing my fate by faith. I took a deep breath and looked over at Tim before lowering my eyes to the page I somehow knew would lead me somewhere other than here. I began to read. W.G. Mansfield never saw the accomplishments and accolades of his writing. He authored 12 books in a matter of 3 years along with countless short stories. He never became published while he lived, having been rejected by all the major publishing houses with his first manuscript. William never attempted to query another, believing his work not worthy. William Gregory Mansfield was driving home from a seminar one stormy night when a bolt of lightning struck the vehicle he was driving as it crossed the Missouri River. Witnesses traveling behind him and heading toward him in the opposite lane stated the entire bridge's steelwork lit up in a brilliant glowing flash as his car traveled through the railing and over the side high above the deep, swift water. Every one of those witnesses, 6 separate accounts traveling in 4 separate vehicles, claimed the victim's car did not fall toward the water, but instead rose into the sky and disappeared in a great ball of light. William's vehicle nor body was ever recovered, and his death remains a mystery. All his works have since been published by Penguin Random House and inducted into the Library of Congress in 2010. Upon finishing the last word of the printed paragraphs within The Slaying of Demons by W.G. Mansfield, a bright light flashed throughout the library as the power flickered in every building on Capitol Hill for several seconds. When the power was restored, all was as it was, except for the copy of William's book found lying open to the last paragraphs of the author's page. There was a single fingerprint freshly seared into the bottom of that page. There was no sign of either Tim Gallo or William Gregory Mansfield ever again. The Magic 8-Ball is still produced using the same model as its original inception and sold today under the company name Mattel. Does it still turn a profit? It is decidedly so.
The planetary survey was expected to take 9 months. The surveyors, all carefully selected by the company, would be on their own for the entire duration. Their goal was to locate valuable deposits on the unexplored planet and hopefully make money for their employer. A mobile construction crew had landed on the planet a week earlier to assemble their habitat and had already moved on to the next planet by the time the surveyors arrived. Their dropship, the Stardust, was a small transport vessel manned by a captain and 2 crew members. The captain, Yasmala Teg, had been traveling through the near-lawless reaches of that sector for several years, transporting all sorts of surveyors to and from their destinations. Edward Jinbrazer was her frequent passenger, and the one whom she was most fond of. She had transported him to his last 5 surveys and had grown to understand his subtle humor and sly wit as much as anyone could. Despite his often distant demeanor, the 2 of them had formed a romantic relationship. He was quite the enigma to her, a man who seemed to prefer his relationships in small doses, who always helped keep her bed warm. Though he never let her get too close, she took solace in her knowledge that the gentleman could never hurt her.
I suppose he thinks our relationship is perfect as is,
she thought to herself as Jinbrazer slowly woke next to her. She looked out the window at the planet below while the man yawned and stretched out his arms. After a 5-day journey, they had reached their destination. The planet she found herself staring at was Earth-like in some ways, in that the length of a day and its gravitational force were nearly identical to that of home. There were striking differences, though, most notably the very thin and poisonous atmosphere. Viewed from space, the surveyors and the crew seemed to think the surface looked like someone had swirled ketchup and mustard together. The company didn't have high hopes for the planet. In fact, hope was so limited that they hadn't even bothered to name it, only giving it the designation of P12-348. It was a lifeless and desolate place. Still, they felt it merited at least a cursory look, so a minimal crew of 3 surveyors was given the assignment. Upon touching down, Captain Teg took her time making sure the surveyors were settled into their simple yet sturdy habitat. The company certainly hadn't overspent on the lodgings, but the basic structure would serve its purpose, and it provided each man with his own quarters. Once it was clear that the habitat was in perfect working order, she promised to return for them in 9 months. As she went to board her ship, she made eye contact with Jinbrazer one last time. He smiled at her and winked, but didn't speak. She nodded and disappeared into the ship. Soon the men were alone. Between the 3 of them, there was no official leader, which was common for such a small crew. Per company policy, they were all carefully screened to make sure they had the correct personalities for their mission. There were no egoists among any of the survey teams. They were level-headed, kind, and curious, perhaps even a little boring. They were expected to get along well enough and avoid squabbles. Decisions would be made by committee, and in the rare event that the team members disagreed on something, compromise was expected. This formula had worked well for the company, and there was no reason to expect anything different this time. Of the 3, Jinbrazer was the longest serving, already having worked on 6 previous surveys. He considered himself the smartest of the 3, and he knew that most of the technical chores would fall to him. Jed Collins was the second longest serving member with 4 planetary surveys to his name, 3 of which had been served alongside Jinbrazer. The last member was someone new, Benedict Jasperson, a man on his first planetary survey. In Jinbrazer's assessment, Jasperson didn't appear to be among the smartest of the surveyors he had served with, not by a long shot. His size and strength would be his contribution. On paper, all 3 members were interchangeable with one another. Each one was trained in and expected to be able to perform every task, but in practice, team members were often specialized in their duties. As Jinbrazer saw it, most of the heavy lifting and physical chores would be done by Jasperson. Collins would be the in-between guy, sometimes filling in on technical duties and sometimes doing the physical work. It was no mistake that these 3 were assigned to work together. In many ways, they complemented each other well. The first 4 days went as expected. Jinbrowser uplinked the computers to the satellites that had been left in orbit by Stardust. He fed them instructions and plotted the most promising courses for them. They would map the planet's surface and subsurface as well. Jasperson spent his days in the runabout, exploring the planet's valleys and peaks in person. Even with all the technology available, there was still no substitute for getting outside and surveying with one's own eyes. Collins went about setting up the analyzers, replicators, and other various machines. It wasn't long, though, until Jasperson really began to stand out. His personality was unlike any of the other surveyors Jinbrowser had ever worked with. He was friendly, amiable, and talkative. That's not to say that the others hadn't been nice, but there was a distinct and noticeable difference. Jasperson made it a point to ask the other men about themselves, about their families, and about their dreams for the future. He was always smiling, and his big lumbering form made him look like a proverbial gentle giant. When he wasn't working or regaling the other men with his stories, he spent his time writing in his old-style handwritten journal. It was a very curious attribute, Jinbrowser thought, to journal in such a primitive way. Jasperson wrote in it every night, and though Jinbrowser and Collins both thought it to be an odd habit, neither of the men bothered to ask him what he was writing about. Day 5. After all of the equipment had finally been set up and calibrated, and a rudimentary map of the surface had been completed, it was Jasperson who broke out with a bottle of whiskey and encouraged the other men to celebrate their accomplishment. Consumption of alcohol was against company policy, but Jasperson had snuck it onto the planet nonetheless.
"Time to celebrate, boys,"
he told them. Jinbrowser considered the offer. He really had no need for that type of fraternization with his colleagues, but at the same time he was growing fond of the dumb, hard-working giant who was in front of him holding the bottle. He agreed to one drink. Collins was game too, so that night the three men sat down in the common room and shared the bottle. Jinbrowser, as it turned out, ended up taking far more than one drink. As the bottle emptied and the whiskey had its way with the men, the conversation flowed. Looking at Jasperson, Jinbrowser spoke in slightly slurred words.
"Tell me, Jasperson, why are you so nice? You're just so talkative."
He took a drink, then slammed down the glass.
"I guess nobody told you you wouldn't fit in with this company." "It's just how I am, Jin,"
Jasperson replied with a smile.
"It's how I've always been." "Bullshit!"
Jinbrowser shouted louder than he intended.
"Come on, nobody who chooses to work in deep space is that nice. Tell us, what are your secrets? You gotta have something. Come on, Jas, confession is good for the soul."
Collins nodded in agreement. Jasperson took the bottle to his lips and, tossing his head all the way back, finished it.
"Looks like we're done here, fellas."
He smiled mischievously. The three men laughed, but soon a silence settled over the room. With the alcohol making their eyelids heavy, Jinbrowser and Collins began to doze off, not even making the effort to find the way to their personal quarters. Despite the fact that he had consumed over half the bottle, Jasperson seemed less affected than the others. Once they passed out, he wrote in his journal. Then he too closed his eyes for the night, sleeping in the common room with the other two men. A couple of hours later, Jinbrowser woke up. He stumbled to the bathroom to relieve himself, then slowly wandered back to where the other two men were sleeping. He noticed that Jasperson, who was spread out on the couch, had his journal lying across his chest. Normally, Jinbrowser respected everyone's privacy, but still a little drunk, he couldn't help but wonder what kinds of things Jasperson had written down. Who was this enigma lying before him?
"This guy just doesn't fit in here,"
Jinbrowser thought as he slowly lifted the journal from Jasperson's chest. Sitting down, he began flipping through the pages, his eyes taking longer than usual to focus on the writing. With the room spinning around him, he was only able to read bits and pieces, but what he saw concerned him. "I'm so bored. I really need some excitement around here. Can't stand it. Gonna snap soon. I'm really trying. It's just so dull. Jinbrazer is nice but boring. Collins is so bland." Jinbrazer was confused. How could Jasperson have possibly made it past the company's psychological screening process? Someone like him, who got bored after 5 days, should have been flagged well before he was ever sent on a survey. Still, at that moment, he was too tired and too drunk to give it much more thought. He carefully closed the journal and gently placed it back on Jasperson's chest. Jasperson snored peacefully. Jinbrazer walked slowly to his quarters and passed out for the rest of the night on his bed. Day 6. The morning was a blur for Jinbrazer. He awoke hungover and grumpy, and Collins didn't look too much better. Still, the company wasn't paying them to sit around nursing their hangovers. The work had to continue. The 3 men decided that Jasperson and Collins would take the runabout to a distant outcropping that showed some promise. Together, they'd use a drill to check several hundred meters below the surface. Jinbrazer was thankful for the opportunity to stay back and analyze the satellite feeds, and he closed himself in the upstairs tech room with the lights low. Jasperson and Collins entered the airlock and loaded the runabout with their equipment. They double-checked the integrity of their exploration suits and then shut the door between the habitat and the airlock. Once the airlock depressurized, they opened the outside door and headed toward their destination. From the tech room on the 2nd level, Jinbrazer watched out the window as they slowly disappeared. Jasperson could still be heard cracking jokes over the radio, and Jinbrazer soon turned the volume down so he could concentrate. An eerie calm fell over the habitat, and Jinbrazer became lost in his work. The 2 men were expected to be gone 8 hours, so Jinbrazer was surprised when only 4 hours later he saw the runabout come flying back over the horizon. "Why are they moving so fast?" he wondered. Jinbrazer reached over and turned up the volume on the communicator, and Jasperson's desperate voice came through.
Jin! Can you hear me?"
Jinbrazer responded to the call. "Yeah, what's wrong?"
"Meet me in the airlock. Collins. He's dead, man. He's dead."
Jinbrazer bolted upright in his seat, then ran down the stairs toward the airlock. He watched through the window as Jasperson skillfully maneuvered the runabout inside. In the back of the vehicle, he could see Collins' bloody body. His protective suit was torn open, and his helmet was cracked. The outside door closed, and Jinbrazer waited several agonizing minutes as the airlock pressurized. When it was safe, Jinbrazer opened the inside door and ran to the runabout. Looking closely at the body, he could see that Collins' head had been cracked open. By what, he didn't know. Jasperson spoke first.
"A boulder landed on top of him. I couldn't stop it."
His voice was shaken. Then he addressed Collins as if he was still alive.
"Oh man, Collins. I'm so sorry."
Jinbrazer looked at the body of his friend. Collins had been a good man, and he deserved a better fate than having some rock land on his head. Jinbrazer had always enjoyed working with Collins. He had been reliable and friendly, and he even had a good sense of humor once someone got to know him. They cleaned the body as best they could and placed it in a new exploration suit. Per company policy, the body was stored outside, a short distance from the habitat. It would be retrieved when the dropship returned. Jasperson explained that Collins had set up the drill under an outcropping of rocks. When the drill started, the whole area shook, and a large boulder came loose. Jasperson saw it fall, but couldn't warn Collins in time. Jinbrazer cursed at his dead friend for being so careless. That evening, Jinbrazer used the long-range communicator to send a message to the company. Collins, ID number 2545-49, deceased. The brief message didn't seem like a proper way to pay tribute to his friend, but the communicator required an extraordinary amount of power, and even a small message could nearly deplete the battery banks, which would then take several days to fully recharge. The message would reach the company headquarters in a few days. If they followed standard procedure, they would eventually send a replacement for Collins, but he had no idea how long that would take. He couldn't imagine that this expedition, with its unpromising nature and remote location, would rank too high on their list of priorities. The next few days passed uneventfully. Jasperson continued with his amiable ways, seemingly unaffected by the death of his co-worker. Every night he wrote in his journal, and Jinbrowser could hear the loud strokes as they swept across the paper. Both men worked extra hours to make up for the loss of their companion, but Jinbrowser managed a few moments to reflect on his situation. He still wasn't sure how someone with Jasperson's personality wound up on their mission. What the hell was he writing about every night? And the question that bothered him most of all, why would Collins, a man with years of experience, make the rookie mistake of setting up a drill beneath an outcropping? Day 9. Even though it was unlike Jinbrowser to become nosy and meddlesome, there was nothing typical about the survey that was unfolding around him. With that thought, he finally allowed his curiosity to get the better of him. While Jasperson was out in the runabout, Jinbrowser stepped carefully into his room and spotted a giant man's journal on the bedside table. Picking it up, he perused through the pages until he landed on the entry from day 6, apparently written shortly after Collins had died. His mouth dropped when he saw it. It wasn't a typical journal entry. It was a letter, written to him.
Hi, Jin. I was awake last night when you read my journal. You thought I was asleep. You were wrong. It's okay, I'm not mad. In fact, I think it presents me with a unique opportunity since I figure there's a 50-50 chance you'll try and read my journal again at some point. Remember what you said to me, that confession is good for the soul? Well, I've been thinking about that, and I've come to believe that you are probably right. So here it is. I killed Collins, and it was fun. It was just a sudden urge that I tried to resist, but once I gave in, I can't even begin to describe how much I enjoyed it. I know you've never killed anyone, but you should really try it. It's the best feeling in the world, and despite what you're probably thinking right now, I bet you would really get off on it. Just bringing that rock down on his head again and again made me so happy. It was only afterward, seeing how it affected you, that I began to feel bad. But I'm already starting to feel better just writing this down. It's like a burden has been lifted off of me. I'm even smiling as I write this. So, what do we do now, Jin? I'll tell you what we do. You put this journal down and you pretend like you never read it. Beautiful, right? I get to confess, and you get to live. And just so we're clear, if I find out that you know my secret, I'll have to kill you too. But I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, Jin, and I'm going to assume that you're not actually reading this. You're the only friend I have right now. So let's keep it that way.
Jinbrowser read the passage several times, absorbing its contents as a sense of dread overcame him. There were no other notes to him in the rest of the journal. This has to be a joke, he thought, but in his gut he knew the truth. With his hands shaking, he carefully placed the journal back on the table, leaving it in the position he found it in. A million thoughts raced through his mind. He'll never let me off this planet alive. He's just playing with me. I don't want to die. I should have told Yasmila I love her. A few minutes later, the sound of the approaching runabout filled the habitat. Jinbrowser resolved himself to act normally. He looked himself over in the bathroom mirror and used his hands to straighten his clothing. He took a deep breath. After clearing the airlock, Jasperson entered the common area.
Hey, Jin. Man, I gotta tell you, there's nothing out there but common rocks.
Jinbrowser nodded his head in agreement and forced a little laugh. He could feel a small bead of sweat forming on his forehead. Jasperson sat on the couch and put his feet up.
I'm gonna sleep good tonight. You should really get out of the habitat more, Jin. You'll sleep so much better if you're physically active.
Jinbrowser nodded again. Jasperson looked at him closely.
You okay, Jin?
Jinbrowser nodded.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Collins. I miss him.
The smile fell from Jasperson's face. For several moments he stared straight at Jinbrowser.
Yeah, right, Collins. I almost forgot about him.
Suddenly his voice became animated.
But hey, if you miss him, he's right out there.
Jasperson let out a laugh and pointed out the window to a small bump just a short distance from the habitat. Jinbrowser didn't know how to respond and simply looked at the floor. Jasperson stopped laughing.
Sorry, Jin. That was a shitty joke.
That's okay. I think I'm gonna go to sleep now. Jinbrowser walked to his bedroom as Jasperson protested behind him.
Hey, stay up a little while and play a game with me.
A thought, one he couldn't verbalize, popped into Jinbrowser's head. We're already playing a game, you stupid bastard. Day 13. Jinbrowser had lived in terror for days, constantly having to remind himself to act as if he didn't know that he was living with a vicious killer. Forced smiles, meaningless pleasantries, casual conversations. They all became harrowing chores for him. He toyed with the idea that he should sneak up on Jasperson and attack him and hopefully incapacitate him with a single blow. But the truth was that Jinbrowser was too much of a coward to do so. Jasperson outweighed him by at least 45 kilos, and Jinbrowser knew he would stand very little chance in an outright brawl, even if he went with a surprise attack. Still, it was an option that he kept under consideration, mostly because he knew that most likely Jasperson would eventually have to kill him no matter what. It would simply be too much of a risk for Jasperson to let him off of the planet alive. He decided for the time being to go along with Jasperson's game until he could think of a better plan. One idea he had already discarded was sending a message to the company and telling them about Jasperson's murderous ways. Too risky, he thought. Jasperson would most likely notice the drop in battery power and become suspicious. Regardless, the company would already be sending out a ship. Day 14. Jinbrowser awoke to find Jasperson standing next to his bed.
Good morning, Jinbrowser,
Jasperson said in a monotone voice. Jinbrowser shot up.
What are you doing in here?
The fear in his voice was obvious.
Relax, my friend.
Jasperson's voice was strangely calm and slow. Then, without answering Jinbrowser's question, he continued.
I'm going to take the runabout to check out another spot on the western plains. It'll be a long day for me.
Jinbrowser nodded his understanding. Jasperson turned and left the room, and with his voice suddenly regaining its natural charm, he yelled over his shoulder.
See you tonight, Jin.
Jinbrowser stayed in bed until he heard the airlock open and the runabout speed away. He got up and forced himself to eat breakfast, even though his stomach felt like it was tied in knots. As he walked past Jasperson's open bedroom, he glanced inside and saw the journal. It had been placed on the nightstand and balanced upright so that it was standing on its edge. Its white cover stood out in the darkened room. Jasperson had never left his journal in such a position before. It was there to draw his attention. Jinbrowser knew it. For an hour, Jinbrazer argued with himself about whether he should read the journal or not. The strange combination of fear and curiosity swirled in his mind. He didn't want to play Jasperson's game anymore, but he knew he was already sucked in whether he read it or not. Finally, he darted over to the journal and picked it up. He flipped it open and found another page addressed to him.
Hi, Jen. Did you read my journal the other day? When I got back, it seemed like you were trying to hide something. I considered killing you right there on the spot. I'm glad I didn't, because right now you're my only friend, and I hate when I have to kill my friends. For now, I'm just going to assume that you didn't read it. I know you're probably still shaken up over the whole Collins mess, so that's what's got you acting all weird, right? Please, if you're reading this, don't let me know. It's quite therapeutic for me to unload all of this on you, but I can't take the chance that I'm really and truly letting you peek into my mind. Jen, I want you to know that I never wanted any of this to happen. I came out here with every intention of working hard and being good, but even more so, I needed to get far away from some people who were coming to realize the type of person I really am. Do you know how hard it was for me to get past a psych evaluation? I had to let that bitch of a psychologist probe my mind. I thought I had her fooled, but she was very good. She seemed to know I wasn't right for this type of work. She's actually the one who suggested I start writing my thoughts down in a journal. She said it would help keep my mind occupied when I got bored. I never got the chance to tell her it worked, because I killed her once I realized she was going to deny my application. It's too bad. She was stunning. She dressed sharp and she wore some great jewelry. In fact, I have a diamond ring of hers in my drawer. It's beautiful. You should really look at it when you get the chance.
There was still more to read, but Jinbrazer paused at that point. He remembered hearing about the disappearance of one of the company's psychologists a couple of months earlier. Nobody had a clue about what had happened to her. He looked down at the nightstand in its unlocked drawer. Slowly and methodically, he lowered his hand and opened it. Inside, he found only one thing, a sealed plastic bag. Inside the bag was a diamond ring. And the diamond ring? It was still being worn by a dried, severed finger. Jinbrazer gasped and dropped the bag to the floor. His breathing increased as he looked around to make sure he was still alone. He was. Collecting himself, he reached down, retrieved the bag from the floor, and placed it carefully back inside the drawer. He closed it and went back to the journal.
The next psychologist liked me quite a bit more. She was easy to manipulate. She never even knew who was really in charge. She gave me a terrific recommendation, and she was a great lay, too. So here I am, out here far away where my past can't catch up to me so easily. And I want you to know, Jen, I'm trying. I want to be good, but sometimes that's just so boring.
Jinbrazer carefully placed the journal back in the position he had found it. Then he did the only thing he could do. He tried his best to forget what he had just read and got to work. Jasperson made his way back to the habitat toward the end of the day. His loud, amiable voice boomed through the room.
I tell you, Jen, there's nothing valuable out there at all. The company didn't have too much hope for this stupid rock, and they were right.
Jinbrazer nodded his head and reminded himself to act normal. Jasperson continued.
You know how lucky you are. You get to sit in here all day, not really lifting a finger. It's okay, though. I really like flying around in that runabout.
Jinbrazer's ears perked up. Maybe he had imagined it, but there had been a very slight emphasis when Jasperson spoke the word finger. He suddenly felt nauseous.
I think I need to lie down. I don't feel so well.
Jasperson's wide smile instantly fell from his face, only to be replaced by a serious look that spread across his visage.
Is that so?
Yeah, I just need a nap. Jasperson stared intently for several seconds, then his smile instantly returned.
Okay, you go lay down. By the way, there's another outcropping out to the east that I'm going to go check out tomorrow. I'll probably leave early, so I'll see you when I get back.
Ginbrowser mumbled his assent and headed to his quarters. Day 15. Ginbrowser awoke alone in the habitat. As he walked into the common area, he glanced into Jasperson's quarters, almost as a reflex. The first thing he noticed was that the journal was once again left out in the open. It was lying on top of the crisply made bed. The diamond ring, sans the finger, was placed on top of it. Jasperson was becoming more and more emboldened with this game of his, and Ginbrowser wondered how much longer it would be before he was killed. Ginbrowser glared at the journal. He wanted to destroy it. He wanted to read it. In the end, he left it in its place.
I'm done with this, Jasperson,
he muttered under his breath. He went to the tech room and began his work for the day, though he wondered if there was any point in doing so. Slowly, he started focusing on the screens in front of him. It wasn't until late afternoon that he noticed something was amiss on the computer. The logs recorded that an incoming message had been received 5 days earlier, but when he went to look for the message itself, it was missing entirely. It had been erased. Someone from the outside, probably the company, had contacted them. Whatever they said, Jasperson didn't want him to see it. He thought back to the journal. Was it possible that there would be some mention of the deleted message somewhere within its pages? Despite having the opportunity to do so, he had yet to thoroughly go through all of the journal's entries. He cursed Jasperson for his actions, and then half-heartedly walked down the stairs and into the other man's quarters. He carefully moved the ring from atop the journal and placed it on the bed. He flipped through it, looking to see if the information he sought was in there. There was no mention of the deleted message, but on the last page he found another note addressed to him.
Hello, Jen. Things have been a little boring here lately, haven't they? So with that, I have a little challenge for you. And I think it will be fun for both of us. Here it is. When I get back later, I'm going to say something completely innocuous. Just a little meaningless phrase. Let's go with, the sky is beautiful today. When I say that, can you act as if it's just a pointless bit of banter? Or will you start to stutter and sweat? Will your eyes look away from me as you try your best to pretend that I haven't just triggered your survival instinct? Will the tone of your voice change as you try your best to swallow the bile and fear coming up from your throat? We'll find out. Let's see how normal you can act when you know every subtle nuance is being studied. That is, of course, assuming you've actually read this. If you haven't, then you'll have no discernible reaction, and no problems. Last thing, Jen, regardless of what happens, it's been fun knowing you. I honestly did want this new life to work out. I guess my biggest failing is my inability to change who I really am.
Ginbrowser flung the journal across the room in anger. It hit the wall and bent at the corner. Jasperson's challenge seemed simple enough on the surface. Don't stutter, don't sweat, don't hesitate, don't answer too fast, don't blink. Just respond normally when he mentions the beautiful sky. But Ginbrowser knew his nerves would make it much more difficult than that, especially if Jasperson really was as observant as he seemed to think he was. Finally, his emotions took over. He ran over to where the journal had fallen to the floor and stomped on it. Fear and anger fueled him as he picked the book up and beat it against the wall. He collapsed on Jasperson's bed for a minute. He knew he was as good as dead. He stormed back up to the tech room, determined to send a message to the company telling them that Jasperson was a murderer. The game was ending, so it no longer mattered if Jasperson knew he sent the message or not. It wouldn't help him personally, but at least it might make it so Jasperson would one day have to answer for his crimes. He turned on the long-range communicator and instantly saw blinking red lights.
Shit!
Jinbrowser yelled as he suddenly realized that the communicator wasn't functioning. He removed the cover and saw that some of the internal workings had been removed.
That son of a bitch!
He screamed out. Out the window, he could see Jasperson's runabout returning to the habitat. A trail of red dust was kicked up in its wake. Jinbrowser felt a moment of desperation. He had no place to hide, and he couldn't possibly outmuscle Jasperson. He looked along the wall of the tech room where he saw the protective exploration suits hanging. His only chance of survival would be to leave the habitat. Even with the suit on, he wouldn't survive more than a day, but it would give him time to hopefully think of a plan to defeat Jasperson. He quickly began putting the suit on. Its batteries were at full power, which meant 20 hours of air for him. If he could manage to get into the runabout, that would provide him with even more life support. He knew that it would be impossible for him to move quietly with the suit on. He would have to wait for Jasperson to go to his quarters, then run out as fast as he could. He could hear the outer airlock doors opening, and then the runabout slowly moved to the inside. The airlock filled with air again, and the inner door opened. Jinbrowser remained upstairs in the tech room, standing as still as possible. He could hear Jasperson's voice from downstairs. It was as cheerful as ever.
Hey, Jin, look at this rock sample I found. I don't think it has much value, but it's got some interesting patterns you should look at.
Jinbrowser heard Jasperson walk toward his quarters. If he hadn't seen that his journal had been damaged, he would notice it in the next few seconds. He heard a mighty thump come from the downstairs area, as if a large object had been dropped. The heavy footsteps left Jasperson's quarters and quickly moved towards Jinbrowser's room. Jinbrowser knew he only had a few seconds before the maniac would check for him upstairs. He bolted down the flight as quickly as the suit would allow him. As he ran into the common area, he noticed a heavy yellow rock that had been dropped by Jasperson. It was the size of his head. He glanced at it only a moment and then kept running, unsure if Jasperson was following him or not. Behind him, Jasperson's loud voice rang out from the other side of the room.
Hey!
Jinbrowser stopped just shy of the airlock door.
The sky is beautiful today, isn't it?
Jasperson's voice was eerily monotone. Jinbrowser didn't speak, and he refused to turn around. Jasperson spoke up again.
I said, the sky. It's beautiful today. Don't you think?
He gave a slight chuckle. There was only dead silence in the habitat. To Jinbrowser, the quietness seemed to last for a minute, though it was probably only for a few seconds. The complete absence of sound was eventually broken by the methodical footsteps of Jasperson as he walked over to the rock he had just dropped. Jinbrowser, who still hadn't turned around and faced Jasperson, made a desperate lunge for the button that would open the airlock door. The door whisked open, and in one swift movement, he dove inside the airlock and pushed a second button that would shut the door behind him. As it began to close, he turned and saw Jasperson walking quickly towards him. All of his teeth were showing through his goofy smile, but his steps had a sinister, rapid gait. The door closed only seconds before Jasperson got to it. Jinbrowser quickly latched a helmet onto his exploration suit and then immediately pushed a third button that began evacuating the air out of the chamber. He was safe. The inside door couldn't be opened once the evacuation procedure had begun. He could hear Jasperson repeatedly slam his fist into the door. The heavy door vibrated with each punch, but it was strong and couldn't break easily. Jinbrowser breathed a sigh of relief and went over to examine the runabout. After Jasperson's latest excursion, its batteries were only at a quarter power. That didn't matter. It was enough to get him away from danger. A minute later, the outer airlock door opened and he drove several meters out of the building. He stopped for a moment and looked back at the habitat. Through one of the windows, he could see Jasperson standing in the common room staring back at him. Jasperson waved, smiled, and made a friendly-looking gesture for Jinbrowser to return. Jinbrowser turned again and drove off towards the horizon, to a spot where he could no longer see the habitat. He stopped and took a moment to assess his situation. He couldn't stay out of the habitat indefinitely. His suit and the runabout would only offer him life support for so long. He would have to think of a way to get back inside, but no ideas came to him. As he sat in the runabout contemplating his fate, he was startled when a large shape passed over him in the sky. He shot a look upwards and immediately recognized the outline. It was the Stardust, and it was headed towards the habitat.
"The message,"
Jinbrowser whispered.
"Yasmela."
He shook his head back and forth as he slowly began to realize what the erased message must have said. It had been the Stardust letting them know when it was going to arrive with a replacement for Collins. It was no coincidence that Jasperson had chosen that day to end his game. Jinbrowser turned the runabout around and headed toward the habitat as fast as the vehicle would take him. Yasmela and her crew were all in danger, but he was at least 15 minutes away. As he approached the habitat, he could see the form of the Stardust perched on the landing platform atop the structure. A transport tube which allowed the crew direct access to the inside extended from below the ship. Jinbrowser became more concerned when he saw that all of the habitat lights were out. It was dark inside and out, and only its silhouette showed up against the setting sun and the dusky yellow sky. The darkness indicated either a full electrical failure or that somebody had intentionally powered the habitat down. He pulled up next to the building and carefully stepped from the runabout. Walking with trepidation, he moved up to the window and looked inside. The common room was dimly lit by the setting sun. He could see a small form moving through the room, which he quickly recognized as Bannon, one of the Stardust's crew members. Bannon held a small flashlight in his hand, though most of the light was lost within the cavernous room. Jinbrowser banged his fist against the window, but the solid structure absorbed his blows easily and he went unseen by Bannon. Suddenly, Jinbrowser noticed something else moving within the habitat. Slowly and out of the shadows, the mammoth shape of Jasperson moved up behind Bannon. Jinbrowser tried to scream. He tried to warn the crew member of the danger right behind him. Jasperson, who was only a few steps behind Bannon, turned and looked at Jinbrowser. Even in the dim light, his toothy smile showed bright. In only an instant, the smile dropped from his face and his hand shot out as he grabbed Bannon by the neck, pulling him in. With a quick jerk, he turned Bannon's head all the way around. Bannon's lungs let out one last breath as he died with a surprised look on his face. Jasperson dropped the body to the ground, and apparently not feeling as if he had completed his task, he picked up the large yellow rock and brought it down on Bannon's head. Blood splattered all over the room as the rock smashed into the dead man's skull. Though Jinbrowser couldn't hear what was happening inside, he knew the sound of the slamming rock must have been loud. 2 people ran down the stairs from the tech room and Jinbrowser's heart sank when he recognized Yasmela. Hack, the ship's other crewman, was with her.
"Go back!"
he screamed uselessly.
"Leave!"
Jasperson once again disappeared into the shadows. In the near darkness, it took a moment for the two shipmates to register what had happened to Bannon. Yasmila peered closer and closer at the form on the ground. From outside, Jinbrazer could see her turn away in shock as she realized her crewman was dead. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of Jinbrazer frantically waving his arms and pointing to the darkened corner in which Jasperson had faded. She turned to look just as Jasperson emerged from the shadows. Taking giant quick steps, he had the rock held high above his head, which he then brought down on Hack's skull, before the crewman even knew what was going on. Hack collapsed from the strike and blood flowed from his nose. He was dead. Yasmila screamed as Jasperson grabbed her by her shirt and pulled her towards him. He paused as if to contemplate his next move. Then he punched her with his big, meaty hand. The force of the blow was sufficient to knock her unconscious, and she fell to the ground as Jasperson loosened his grip on her shirt. With the woman temporarily incapacitated, Jasperson picked up Hack's body and carried it in front of him to the window where Jinbrazer was standing. He smiled and used Hack's limp hand to wave at Jinbrazer. He dropped the body and began laughing uncontrollably. Jinbrazer had seen more than he wanted. With no real plan of action, he got back into the runabout and drove off again over the horizon, feeling thoroughly defeated. Yasmila was still alive, but there was nothing he could do for her at that moment. He stayed away overnight until the sunlight slowly began creeping back over the horizon. After an uncomfortable night spent in the runabout, he accepted that there was no further point in staying away. No plan he could think of would be even remotely successful in saving his life. He would try to reason with Jasperson, maybe even make a bargain for Yasmila's life, but he knew there was virtually no chance of that working. Still, a quick death at Jasperson's hands might actually be preferable to the drawn-out death that awaited him outside the habitat. He turned the runabout around and headed back. On his return approach, he noticed that unexpectedly the stardust was gone. The power to the habitat was still out. He made a circle around the building to make sure that Jasperson wasn't waiting outside in an exploration suit. He saw nothing. He parked the runabout outside the common room window and looked inside. The bodies of Bannon and Hack were on the floor, and blood was everywhere, but there was no sign of Jasperson or Yasmila. With the power out, the door to the airlock wouldn't open for him automatically. He would have to open it manually. Stepping down from the runabout, he reached underneath it and retrieved a large metal crank that could be used in a power failure situation to open the airlock doors. He approached the outer door, but he stopped when he saw something moving in the airlock through the window. It was a person, but it was too small to be Jasperson. It was at that moment that Jinbrazer understood the final move of Jasperson's game. Yasmila was inside the airlock, alive. There was still plenty of air for her, but with the power outage, she had no way of opening the inside door and getting back into the living quarters. The inside door could be manually cranked open too, but it was unlikely that Jasperson had left a crank in there for her. There was no protective suit for her to put on. If Jinbrazer was to get back inside, he'd have to expose Yasmila to the thin, poisonous atmosphere of the awful planet they were on. If he did that, she would be dead in 15 seconds or less. Jinbrazer considered his options. He could survive outside in his suit and the runabout for several more hours. Eventually, his power would run low. His oxygen recycler would stop working, and he would die. Taking into account the size of the airlock and the fact that the life support had been down for several hours, Jinbrazer estimated that Captain Teg had about 25 hours of breathable air left. Then she too would die. I can do nothing, and we both die. I can do something, and only she dies, Jinbrazer reasoned with himself. He made eye contact with Yasmala through the airlock window and held up the crank. He pointed at it and then back at Yasmala. She understood that he was asking, "Do you have one?" She shook her head no. He pressed the palm of his gloved hand up to the window, and on the other side she did the same. He waited hours, hoping that another solution would present itself, but there was no change in the situation. Eventually, the warning lights on his suit came on, and he knew he had to act. He picked up the crank from the surface of the planet. Inside the airlock, Yasmala could see the indicator lights flashing on his suit, and she knew exactly what was happening. "It's the only way," he mouthed to her through the window, though he was saying it to himself as much as he was to her. He saw the momentary panic on her face, but she regained her composure and resolutely nodded her head as if to say,
"It's okay."
They both stared into each other's eyes one final time, and he remembered when he had last held her in his arms. Resigned to the fate that awaited Yasmala, he bent down so that he could stick the end of the crank into the small hole near the bottom of the doorway. Out of the corner of his eye, he could still see Yasmala standing silently in the airlock. He turned away entirely to avoid looking at her again. He took a deep breath and began turning the crank. He saw dust kick up as the door slowly raised and the air shot out into the planet's thin atmosphere. Yasmala was pushed up against the door by the force of the escaping air. As it continued to rise up, Jinbrowser could see her face peek through the widening slit between the door and the ground. Her eyes bulged out, and she had a look of absolute horror pasted over her features. She might have been screaming, but it was also possible that it was simply the air being ripped from her lungs against her will. She thrashed several times before she became still, and as the door continued to rise, her lifeless body rolled outside onto the dusty ground. Jinbrowser cried out in his suit. "Forgive me, Yasmala," he lamented. The moisture fogged the visor of his helmet, but he continued on. The door was high enough for him to crawl under. Once inside, he pulled Yasmala's body back inside. Then he inserted the crank into another square hole and slowly closed the door. He went through the inside door in the same manner. He was no longer afraid of Jasperson. The stardust was gone, and Jasperson was the only possible pilot. In the tech room, he found the battered corpse of a man who he didn't know. Collins's replacement, probably. He carefully stepped over the body to the console and restored power. The habitat systems came back online. Jinbrowser removed his suit and walked down to the common room. Among all the blood and carnage, he saw Jasperson's beaten journal placed in the middle of the table. He sighed, and even while shaking his head as if to say no, he picked up the journal and read the entry that he knew would be waiting for him.
"Hello, killer. Did you like that little bit of fun that I left for you? Admit it. You enjoyed it just a tad, didn't you? I have to say, you surprised me by running out like that. I figured a boring little thing such as yourself would stick around and try to talk your way out of it. I was really going to enjoy slamming that rock into your head. But as it is, I had a great time killing those others in your place. They could still be alive, you know, all 4 of them. I wasn't planning on that massacre, but with you still running around alive out there, I really had no choice. Or maybe I actually was planning to kill everyone. I'll just leave it for you to figure out which one's the truth. I have to say, Jinbrowser, I've learned a lot about myself these last 2 weeks. I know now that I should embrace who I really am. The funny thing is, I was actually good at this job, probably better than you. Did you know that I found a very valuable outcropping over the Western Plains? It's true, and I'm sure there's more. This planet is probably one of the most valuable resources in this sector. And now, it's all yours. Too bad for the company, though. As far as they're concerned, they'll receive a message from the Stardust that all hands on this planet were lost due to unforeseen seismic activity. Then the Stardust itself will eventually disappear in space. I seriously doubt they'll send another team out here. They've already invested way too much on this valueless rock. And you know how cheap they really are. So it's a new start for both of us. Enjoy your life, Gin Browser. I'm sure that one day I'll come back and see you. Maybe I'll kill you. Or maybe I'll just say hi. I suppose it would depend on how I feel at the time. Until then, take care, my friend.
Gin Browser let the book fall to the floor as he contemplated his situation. Jasperson had been right about one thing. The company would not spend any further time or effort on this planet. He would probably be stuck there the rest of his life. The habitat with its food generators and air recyclers could easily keep one man alive indefinitely. But did he really want to live out the rest of his life alone? He looked at the dead bodies around him. Across the room, he noticed the missing parts to the long-range communicator. They were broken and smashed. He fell to his knees. Even for a man who liked solitude, it was too much to bear. And he found himself hoping that one day, Jasperson would indeed come back to visit him.
Chilling tales for dark nights.